CIA search for Noah's Ark, government interest in how the pyramids were built, official interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Atlantis, and all sorts of, sort of weird stuff.
Ladies and gentlemen, beloved of America!
Whatever it is, an intelligence agency doesn't spend 50 years secretly researching and photographing the wooden remains of an old boat. So there's several examples of somebody or people having apparent knowledge of ancient Martian anomalies long before they were officially acknowledged, if you like. They were actually, he said, researching the overall UFO phenomenon and had come to the conclusion that all the sort of significant cases actually had nothing to do with alien visitation, but they viewed it as like a satanic deception. These people in the UFO field who believe the government's hiding the truth, and they're saying to me, well, Nick, it might have been better if you'd hidden the story.
What?
That's one of
ridiculous.
The biggest irony. That's one of the biggest ironies of all. That there were people who are saying you should have acted with self-censorship because it's too reckless and dangerous a story to tell, whether true or not. And I was like, well, basically, off.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Banal of America Audio with your host, Tim Banal.
What is going on, my friends? This is Tim Banal of banalofamerica.com with another edition of BOAA Audio Season 7. We have got an absolute barn burner of a program for you, my friends, as we welcome back prolific Fortean researcher and great friend of the program, Nick Redfern, who's making his long overdue return to BOA Audio with a marathon conversation covering one of his most recent books, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, as well as a previous book, Final Events, which may have profound meaning for the UFO enigma. In the first half of the conversation, which covers The Pyramids and the Pentagon, we'll be discussing stories that are truly strange, including rumors of a Bible being found in the Roswell crash, CIA interest in Noah's Ark, odd references to Martian anomalies found in old literature, which may have actually come from the Voynich manuscript, as well as an overall look at why the government may be looking at ancient mysteries and what they may have found. In the latter half of the conversation, we are going to be covering Nick's 2010 book, Final Events, and we'll delve into the bizarre story detailed in the book of a government think tank dubbed the Collins Elite, which studied UFOs and determined that they were demonic in origin. I found this story to be absolutely chilling and breathtaking, so we're going to be digging really deeply into this one, folks, as we discuss how Nick first heard of the story, various aspects of the Collins Elite's findings, notably their thoughts on Roswell, abductions, and MJ-12, and we're going to have some meta-analysis on what the demonic UFO theory means for UFO research, as well as how ufology reacted to Final Events when it was released a couple of years ago. Altogether, it is a brisk conversation that is also jam-packed with amazing stories, intriguing anecdotes, and thoughtful analysis about a myriad of paranormal mysteries with a true trailblazer in the field of esoteric studies, Nick Redfern. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Nick Redfern, please allow me to provide you with a little background on him. Nick Redfern started his writing career as an 18-year-old in 1982 on a British-based music, fashion, and entertainment magazine called Zero. His interest in UFOs was prompted by his father, who worked on radar with the British Royal Air Force, and who was personally aware of several UFO encounters investigated by the British government in the 1950s. Nick is the author of a number of books on unsolved mysteries and UFOs, including A Covert Agenda, The FBI Files, Cosmic Crashes, Strange Secrets, co-written with Andy Roberts, Three Men Seeking Monsters, Body Snatchers in the Desert, On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, Celebrity Secrets, Monkey Man, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, There's Something in the Woods, Science Fiction Secrets, Contactees, Monsters of Texas, The NASA Conspiracies, The Real Men in Black, Keep Out, Top Secret Places Governments Don't Want You to Know About, The World's Weirdest Places, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, as well as Final Events. Plus, I'm sure there are many others that were not listed here. Nick has written for UFO Magazine, Fortean Times, Fate Magazine, and the British Daily Express newspaper, and has appeared on numerous television programs, including the History Channel's Ancient Aliens, Monster Quest, and UFO Hunters, National Geographic Channel's The Truth About UFOs and Paranatural, and Sci-Fi Channel's Proof Positive. His website is www.nickredfernfortean.blogspot.com. Pretty simple, all one word, nickredfernfortean.blogspot.com. Check it out. And with all that said, my friends, let's get down to business and rock and roll. This interview was recorded on August 30th, 2012. Nick Redfern, talking about the pyramids and the Pentagon, as well as Final Events, on BOA Audio, Season 7. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of BOA Audio Season 7. Very, very excited about this program, folks. It has been way too long. I looked back, actually, into the archive, and the last time our guest here was on for a pure paranormal discussion without the trappings of a New Year's theme was way back on December 30th, 2007. So almost 5 years, which is just shameful on my part. It really has been way too long since we've had him on the program. He's a good friend of mine, someone who I consider really one of the most amazing people in all of the paranormal world, and I'm not just blowing smoke up his ass here. I mean, I've called him at the end of the program before. He is really the Brad Steiger of this generation, putting out so many books, putting out a variety of topics that he's covering. He's not just doing a whole bunch of UFO books at once. He's doing all kinds of different stuff and putting out an amazing array of material constantly. And I talk to a lot of people in the paranormal community who are really in awe of his prolific abilities and research capabilities. So I cannot put him over enough. And as I said, he's a good friend of mine. He's really probably it's difficult for me to be friends with him because I'm in so awe of his talent. And like I said, I'm not blowing smoke up his ass here. This is all true, and it's been a real thrill to get him back here on the program to really get into a lot of this stuff altogether. Of course, I am talking about the amazing Nick Redfern. He is the author of the new book, The Pyramids and the Pentagon. That one just came out this summer. And he's also the author of 20, let me see here on the back, it says, more than 20 other books. And you know, that number just keeps growing year after year. So welcome back to the program, Nick. It's going to be a real delight here to talk about all these different subjects.
Hey, Tim, how's it going?
I can't complain. I'm very happy that we finally got around to doing this. I think I told you on one of the year-end shows a couple of years ago that it was long overdue, and it still took a couple of years. So I'm psyched that we finally sat down.
There is also the fact, we get to hang out. We used to get to hang out quite a bit at the yearly conferences as well. The Boston one. So I guess it's in that sense, it's not like it's been technically 5 years, you know what I mean?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. People should check out also the blog, nickredfernfortean.blogspot.com. I'll bring that up at the end of the show if we have time, that new post, 10 things that ufologists just do not do, which is an awesome post that you just put out. But I guess, give us a little thumbnail on what you've been up to in the past few years. You've had a number of books come out. Give us sort of a little update for the folks who haven't heard from you in a while.
Yeah, sure. Well, over the course of the last 2 years, I've done various books. The Real Men in Black, which is sort of a study, obviously, of the Men in Black phenomenon. I wrote one about 6 years ago for Patrick Weege's Anomalous books called On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, which was a study of sort of the government side of the Men in Black. But the one I had out in 2011, The Real Men in Black, that kind of looked more at the sort of paranormal side, these weirder, odd-looking Men in Black, these sort of skinny, pale, weird types that seem more paranormal based, that were sort of heavily involved in the Mothman saga and things like that. And so, I address various theories, are they aliens? Are they interdimensional time travelers, demons, tulpas? What are they? So that one was sort of like, like a sister type book, even though it was a different publisher, sort of a sister book to the other one where one was the government angle, one was the paranormal angle. Then after that I had Keep Out published, which was like a study of secret installations like Area 51, Hangar 18, the Russian equivalent of Hangar 18, the British equivalent, etc., etc. Yeah. And this year I've had a couple of books out, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, which is the new one, and then later this year, just in time for Halloween, I've got one called The World's Weirdest Places, which is sort of my top 25 favourite paranormal hotspots, I guess, around the planet. So, and, doing the usual stuff, blogging, lecturing, trying to stay out of trouble,
Exactly, yeah.
Or trying to get into trouble, maybe.
Well, like I said, I mean, you're definitely an inspiration for me and for a lot of the listeners in the show, because I've preached on this show many, many times, sort of having to have this array of interests, having to be able to look at all this different stuff. And just like you said, you've got the Men in Black thing, you've got secret bases, you've got now with this new one, the Pyramids and the Pentagon, talking about all kinds of ancient stuff and the government interest in it. So, I mean, it's quite a varied palette of stuff. So I'm really impressed.
Well, I appreciate that, Tim. Thanks. And I mean, I guess I'm one of these people where I don't sort of feel pigeonholed or feel need to be pigeonholed into like, oh, he's a UFO researcher, or he's a cryptozoologist, or she's, an abduction researcher. I sort of consider myself, if I've got an interest in it and it's weird, I'll research and write about it. I don't feel there's any sort of conflict of credibility or not, by doing a book on Bigfoot, then one on Area 51, then one on the Men in Black, and then one on lake monsters. It's like, but sometimes you do find that where people authors particularly don't like to go out that comfort zone of their particular aspect of the paranormal, if you like. And I've never really understood that. I don't get that.
Right, because there's such good and fresh sort of areas to investigate too that you bring out, like the Men in Black stuff, and you didn't mention it, but you had the book on contactees a few years ago, so it's like,
I forgot about that one.
Yeah, there's so many areas that I like that you research and look into and sort of bring to light a lot of this stuff. Now the new one, as I said, the Pyramids and the Pentagon, that's looking at the government's interest in old relics, old religious items, lost civilization, sort of like the culture of the ancients, the lost culture of the ancients, and the mysteries of those cultures, which I think is really interesting because, it stands to reason, but it's something that I had never really looked into or considered, that, of course, like the New Age community has a deep interest in that stuff, and it stands to reason, as I said, that, that the government would, and it's fascinating that you've looked at that, and indeed the government did have quite an interest in all this old stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of talking about, like you said, mystical relics, ancient civilizations, and of course, the whole ancient astronaut scenario. And to be honest, that's an area that, although I've been interested in it since I was a kid, when I was like 10, I think I had, Chariots of the Gods or whatever, for a birthday present, something like that. But I'd never really written about this aspect of, the paranormal or the UFO field, whatever you want to term it. Mainly because, there were dozens of books already out there. Researchers like von Daniken and Zecharia Sitchin who've been digging into all this stuff for decades.
Yeah.
So like, what was the point? And the answer is that there would be no point because I'd just be going over old ground. But the one area that I found, reading about this phenomenon in general, this whole ancient astronaut scenario or whatever, occasionally, I'd pick up on little snippets of stories where there seemed to be an official interest. But, it was like a paragraph in somebody's book which had never been taken any further, which was kind of odd. And then there was like a snippet in somebody else's book.
Yeah.
And as I put all these strands together, I realized that, there were sort of 10 or 15 really interesting stories that if I sort of really dug into them, there would be, you would turn into like a full-length book of, chapters on this case or that case. And that's exactly what happened, where I dug into these little snippets of tales and, was able to sort of expand them into full-blown sections and chapters on things like the CIA search for Noah's Ark, government interest in how the pyramids were built, official interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Atlantis, and all sorts of, sort of weird stuff. So.
Yeah, and it fleshes out a lot of these mysteries, adds a whole other dimension to them, because it's like, it's flummoxing in the same way that the UFO mystery is, where it's like you get the impression that maybe the government knows, maybe there's answers out there that, that are being hoarded away from us.
Well, I think it makes sense in the sense that we know the government or government agencies have taken an interest in UFOs today and paranormal phenomena like remote viewing and ESP and all that sort of stuff. Even things like Ouija boards, the CIA was investigating in the 50s. So if they're investigating modern mysteries, why wouldn't they investigate, ancient mysteries? I think the big thing is nobody sort of chiefly realized that there were these sort of clandestine projects going on, investigating, the mysteries of the past. It's like we just went under the radar, if you like.
Right, exactly. Now, I try to avoid sort of like hitting you with just like, okay, tell me this story or tell me that story, and so, sort of just like touched on some things as I read the book that stood out to me, that things that I'd either never heard about or were particularly bizarre. And one of the first things that really stood out to me was, and I'm sure this story's been floated around in the UFO mythos for years, but it's certainly one that I had never heard, which is surprising because I've read a lot of books, and that's this tale of a Bible or some form of a Bible being found either in the Roswell crash or the Aztec crash. And that to me was really like, whoa, wow, this is amazing. So I guess, talk a little bit about that rumor, I guess you will, because obviously it's certainly not anything that we know for certain, but it's certainly weird.
No, you're right. Yeah, I mean, this is probably one of the most controversial things I talk about in the book. And I don't sort of shy away from pointing out that it is a rumor. It's an outrageously over-the-top story, but it's one that, intriguingly enough, has been spread by people in the official world and spread to people in the UFO research community. So in that sense, it's sort of the onus is on us to investigate it because there are intriguing strands to it. Now, before I sort of get into it, what I would say, this sort of relates to what you might call kind of like Dead Sea Scrolls allegedly found in a crashed saucer or saucers. But one of the things I do point out in the book is that we can verify that in the same year as Roswell and only 1 year before the alleged Aztec crash in 48, that the CIA actually was interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I talk about the story of a guy named Miles Copeland, a senior CIA operative who was based in Damascus in Syria in 47. And he was basically given by this sort of mysterious Bedouin-type character one of these scrolls. And it basically made its way to the CIA, and rumors got back to Copeland that it basically dealt with like prophecies all related to the Book of Daniel, like future events, prophecies, strange dreams. And this is all the sort of stuff that has sort of caught the attention of the CIA over the years with things like its remote viewing and psychic spying programs. So in that sense, we can actually verify that the CIA was interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls in 47. But the story gets far more complicated and controversial because back in the 1980s, a UFO researcher named William Steinman, who was sort of obsessed pretty much with the Aztec story, this crash of an alleged UFO in Aztec, New Mexico in March 1948, which I should hasten to add, is a story that has as many believers as it does disbelievers. Aztec is one of those really controversial cases that kind of polarizes people into the believers, the skeptics, and the outright debunkers, who just, well, not so much debunkers, I would say, believers and skeptics.
Yeah.
Probably the best way to
yeah,
word
definitely
it.
Polarizing is the word for it. So
yes.
People either
but
on it
what's
or not.
interesting, and Steinman was given this story about how supposedly when the military got to the Aztec crash site and managed to access the saucer, they found this sort of ancient parchment inside written in what looked like a very archaic Middle Eastern language where certain portions of it could be deciphered or it seemed to resemble ancient Middle Eastern text, but other parts couldn't, suggesting it was an even older language, that had been lost or whatever. Now, that story was also told to a UFO researcher named Timothy Cooper in the mid-1990s. Cooper was someone who sort of received this second wave batch of so-called MJ-12 documents. You know, the original ones went to like Bill Moore, Stan Friedman, Jamie Chandray in the mid-80s. Cooper got, you know, hundreds of pages, possibly thousands, in the 90s, you know, which sort of amplified the story even further. And he was told a story about, not about Aztec, but supposedly a crash of a UFO in New Mexico, somewhere near the White Sands Missile Range. We're not sure if it actually means Roswell or not, actually, but, you know, the general theme is, again, a UFO crash in the 40s in New Mexico with one of these ancient parchments on board. Now, again, the thing I point out in the book is that, you know, there are a lot of controversies surrounding Cooper's documents in the same way that, you know, the Aztec story provokes controversy. But what we can say is that it seems somebody on the inside was intent on getting this story out, linking the Dead Sea Scrolls with crash saucers. And of course, the big question is why. You know, is it because there's some truth behind it, or is it that somebody is spreading a fabricated story that is so outlandish that it'll dismiss and discredit everything else connected with those stories? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think it's really hard to say. But, you know, as I said, the thing I find most intriguing is that there seems to be a concerted effort by insiders to get this story out there. And, you know, and I don't believe it was done for no reason at all. You know, that would be even more illogical. Yeah. So there had to have been, you know, some sort of, like a modus operandi, if you like, behind it. But what that is, you know, that's the bigger and deeper question, I guess.
Right. That's open to the speculation of everybody. So you can't really Yeah. It's bizarre. It's like a Twilight Zone episode almost. You know, it's like an alien ship crashes, but then inside is this decidedly human item. Yeah.
But then, you know, it's like, why? I mean, I'm not saying it isn't a made-up story, but what I'm saying is, you know, why even spread that? That is the, you know, and it wasn't like it was massively spread throughout the entire UFO community, because most people today don't even know that story.
Right.
It was actually quietly provided to Steinman and Cooper, you know. So that kind of makes you wonder as well, you know, it wasn't like something that was, well, let's blitz the entire UFO community and spread this story, and then we'll reveal it was a fake, and they'll get even more discredited. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
That wasn't what happened. You know, if Cooper and Steinman, the only two people it was given to, didn't ever go public, you know, we would not have known. And even then, neither Cooper nor Steinman really went massively public with it. You know, it just appeared in a few articles here and there. It certainly never made it, you know, to the books, you know, on a large scale, or, you know, even the internet to a significant degree.
Right, yeah. Like I said, I'd never even heard that story, and I've heard a lot of stories, so, you know, that really stood out to me as like, where did, you know, wow. So I'm glad we got to the bottom of that. Now, you mentioned that you talk a lot in the book about the whole Noah's Ark mystery, and just, it's really interesting that how furtive the CIA was about their investigation into it, because you bring to light a lot of sort of official correspondence where it's clear that, like, they had obviously taken pictures and taken a look at this Noah's Ark thing, and other people kept asking about it, and they kept sort of being very circumspect about it to the point where you can kind of read between the lines, which is interesting in and of itself. Like, why are they looking at Noah's Ark, and then why are they being so secretive about it? So it's like a dual mystery in a way. Yeah,
you're right. I mean, there's, you know, the Noah's Ark story, again, that sounds like a classic Raiders of the Lost Ark type thing, you know, Indiana Jones, this sort of, you know, people in government trying to find out the truth, not about the Ark of the Covenant like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, but Noah's Ark, you know, a very different type of ark, but it's still like an adventure story involving spies and, you know, covert operations, etc. But it actually goes back to 1949 when a U.S. Air Force spy plane was flying over Turkey towards the border with the former Soviet Union, because the Russians were building a new military base near the Turkish border. I mean, Turkey being, you know, friends to the West, the fear was this is going to sort of impact upon, you know, Western security. So this spy plane basically took off from mainland Europe, headed across Turkey, and the guys on the plane actually used Mount Ararat as like a guiding point to get to this base. But as they sort of flew over the top of the mountain, which is it's like 17,000 feet high, so at that point, you know, it's thick with ice and snow pretty much all year round.
Right.
One of the guys reported seeing what looked like a wing-type structure sticking out of the ice and snow, but it looked about 600 feet long, which is not sort of the type of thing you see every day, you know, a 600-foot-long wing of an aircraft or whatever. So they got permission to sort of swing around and photograph it, which they did. As they were turning, one of the guys on the other side of the plane said that he could see on a slightly adjacent part of the mountain what looked like another large wing of pretty much a similar length. So, you know, if these were the wings of some sort of aerial craft, you know, they would have an overall width of 1,200 feet, you know, which nobody was flying an aircraft with a wingspan of 1,200 feet, you know, back in 1949. Or never mind today, you know, never mind in 1949.
Right. It's interesting, too, that it goes, you know, flies in the face of the idea of Noah's Ark being a boat, which is obviously something.
Well, that's the thing, yeah. I mean, that's the big question. It's like, you know, if Noah's Ark, if the story is to be taken literally, and it shouldn't be because there are flood legends all around the world, you know, it's not just the Noah's Ark one. Most cultures have a flood legend and a story about their own gods or deities coming down and telling people to build huge arks. So it's not like just one story, you know. Mm-hmm. But, you know, even if it was, and the story was 100% accurate as it's related in the Bible, why on earth would an old, basically almost like a fossilized old boat, why would that interest the CIA? You know, arguably it wouldn't. So it suggests that if there's something weird on Mount Ararat, it goes beyond something that you would normally expect just to be of interest to, like, archaeologists, historians, etc.
Right.
So these photographs basically went back into the Pentagon, vanished for years, but what we know is that at least some of them reached the CIA because, you know, bear in mind this was an Air Force project that photographed them, but the CIA got involved in the early 50s, sent U-2 spy planes up, etc., and there are even stories about sort of high-flying spy balloons being sent over the mountain to photograph it, and collated a lot of information. Now, the problem is, you know, although I was able to actually get about 70 pages of material through the Freedom of Information Act, which, you know, I relate some of this in the book, we're kind of limited. One or two of the photographs have actually now surfaced, and I reproduced one of these in the book. You know, it shows what looks like a dark, coloured object, you know, stuck in the ice.
Yeah.
But, you know, we're sort of limited in what we know, but what we do know is intriguing enough. I mean, to give you an example of the sheer extent to which the CIA chased this story down, I talk about the files from the mid-70s where a new book was published on Noah's Ark, you know, and the author, as we all do, if you're an author, you know, when you've got a book out, you go out and promote it, whether it's at lectures, conferences, you know, or whatever.
Yeah.
And this particular author, his name was Fernand Navarra. He had a book published on Noah's Ark, and he was promoting it at a shopping mall in Washington, D.C. in 1975. And CIA files reveal, these are Freedom of Information Act files, that the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center actually sent out clandestinely people to sit in the audience and listen to him talking about his new book. And they actually talk in the documents about how, you know, listening to what the authors have got to say might help them resolve the Ark problem. Now, of course, and that's a literal quote from the document where they say the Ark problem. And as I point out in the book, you know, how is it that an old wooden boat from thousands of years ago could be causing a problem for the CIA in the 1970s? You know, that again suggests there's far more going on. Now, they never actually referred to it as Noah's Ark. It's called, officially in the Pentagon and the CIA, it's called the Ararat Anomaly. That's how they refer to it. So, you know, it clearly seems to be the case that they're aware of something up there. The Turkish government's kind of reticent to allow people to go right to that specific place. And, of course, it's pretty much inaccessible anyway. You know, we're talking at the very top of the mountain. So, you know, that's why it remains an anomaly. But my view is that whatever it is, an intelligence agency doesn't spend 50 years secretly researching and photographing, you know, the wooden remains of an old boat.
Exactly, yeah. Well, it's interesting, too, because I didn't get a chance to go back and sort of find, where the story runs its course in the Pentagon, in the pyramids in the Pentagon. I think I've been saying the title of the book wrong the whole time. I think I've been saying the Pentagon and the pyramids, so I'm going to...
No, it's the same thing.
But it's interesting because you would think in this age of these Google maps and satellites and everything, and the amazing advancement in photographic technology, that this is a story that should at least have a modern twist to it or a resolution in a sense. But as far as I know, I mean, I haven't heard anything about this Noah's Ark story in years. So what do you think that's all about?
If you Google Ararat anomaly, you'll find quite a bit, and there are people who have actually photographed it, with private satellites, that kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
It's not like it's not in the public domain, but the problem is interpreting it, as to what the bigger problem, of course, is that, although Turkey, people think of Turkey, and I think of desert and hot weather, etc., but the top of Mount Ararat is literally, when I say the top, I'm not talking about the top 50 feet, I'm talking, 3,000 or 4,000 feet. It's thick with dense ice and snow all year round. Now, although it's almost like permanently snow and ice covered, obviously it shifts and changes depending on the severity of the weather. So in other words, at times that the Ararat anomaly is sort of semi-buried and 2/3 buried or 90% buried, then one little piece will, show through the ice again when it recedes slightly. So it's not like, the original image in 1949 that you can still see everything exactly the same today. It varies. And of course, the bigger problem is actually because, it's so difficult to get there, the Turkish government don't want people digging around. Really, the only way to photograph it is by high-flying aircraft or satellite, and most of us don't have access to those things, So that's made it a problem as well, unless you're sort of someone who can sort of, order the newest launch spy satellite, to shift its orbit and say, hey, photograph that.
Right.
Most of us just can't do that,
You'd think either we cheer for global warming, or you think that that the Turkish government
big thing, of course,
drag that thing out. I mean, then people would want to go to Turkey and see the Noah's Ark. So
the big analogy, of course, it's like with Roswell. You can actually visit the crash site. You're not going to find anything unless you're really lucky today, I'm sure. But you can go to the crash site. Unless you're like a really experienced mountain climber, you've got the money and the funding and everything else to get to Turkey and get up the mountain, we cannot go to that crash site or landing site or whatever it is. But what I would say is that we do know, again from the files, that the U.S. intelligence community followed quite closely the sort of careers and statements of various people who were making claims that, it was an ancient crashed UFO. And rather than, that Noah's Ark was sort of a distorted legend of like a space ark, that rather than having sort of 2x2 animals on board, it was like a huge space ark preserving countless examples of animal and human DNA,
right?
In kind of like a DNA type ark, and they followed that quite closely and seriously, going out and reading books and sitting on lectures. So it seems to be the case. Well, I'm sure there was probably differences of opinions within the CIA and the military. They're just human people like us, But I think the very fact that, they were looking at the UFO angle as well clearly demonstrates that at some point there must have been discussions in, the CIA or the Pentagon, hey, could this be like an ancient Roswell or whatever, and I'm pretty sure that was part of the reasoning behind the study of it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Adam Davies, we'll send Adam Davies to go.
There you go, that'd be a good idea, yeah. You might find Bigfoot up there, or the Yeti.
Yeah.
On vacation.
To jump ahead a little bit to some of the other stuff in the book, I found it interesting. You devote quite a bit of discussion to the face on Mars, the Mars anomalies, and what I found was interesting is that you sort of detail how there were references and sort of hints to the Mars anomalies before the 71 Viking probe. And that extends all the way back to this thing with Jonathan Swift, and sort of to tie it into earlier how I was just blown away by the Bible at Roswell story. The story here that Jonathan Swift allegedly decoded parts of the Voynich manuscript was just insane to me. It's wild stuff. Mm-hmm. So I know I've thrown a lot on that, but
that's fine. Yeah, I mean,
call where you want.
I'm sure. Yeah, sure. Well, I'm sure everybody knows the story of the face on Mars, which looks like this eerily human-looking face staring up from the face of Mars, from the surface of Mars, I mean, in this area called Cydonia. Now, NASA doesn't avoid talking about the face on Mars, but their position, or their official position at least, public stance, is that it's kind of like people seeing faces in clouds. They say, well, when the shadows and the light's in the right place or the wrong place, depending on your perspective, it looks like a face. And everybody's seen things like this, sort of Jesus in a bagel or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what we're always seeing.
Right.
It's like if you were to put a spy satellite over Egypt and photograph the Sphinx, that would be photographing the Sphinx. It wouldn't just be a piece of stone that happens to look like a face. It is a face,
Exactly.
So you can also make that argument about Mars. Now, what's interesting is that you're quite right. You can find sort of allusions and references to the face on Mars, literally by that term, way back in the 50s. And if we go back to the Jonathan Swift story, we find references to issues relative to Mars that shouldn't have been known prior to that time. So there's several examples of somebody or people having apparent knowledge of ancient Martian anomalies long before they were officially acknowledged, if you like. And if we go back as far as we can with all this, which is with Jonathan Swift, who wrote the famous novel Gulliver's Travels, among various other titles. Well, that book was published in 1726, and in the story, Swift talks about how when Gulliver was on the island of Laputa, he discovers that the people of the island have found these two satellites, moons in other words, that rotate around Mars. And he talks about the distance, from Mars, their size, their orbit, that kind of thing.
Right.
Now, that's interesting in itself because, we know that Mars has two moons. They're called Phobos and Deimos. The problem is, Swift wrote his novel in 1726. The moons weren't discovered until 1877, which was more than 150 years after Gulliver's Travels was published. Now, in his novel, he talks about, for example, with Deimos, with Phobos, he talks about, sorry, I'm getting mixed up here.
Sorry.
He talks about Deimos, for example, being 8,000 miles from the planet Mars itself. The actual distance is 12,000 miles, so he's actually not that far off. He talks about, other issues relative to orbit and, the length of the days, which again are surprisingly close, for the period of time in question.
Right.
And of course the big question on top of that is, well, where did he get his information from? Now, one of the people I interviewed for the book, who actually does have an intelligence background, but wanted to sort of perhaps appropriately stay in the background to a degree, although I do name him in the book, talked about how supposedly the National Security Agency had been able to determine that Swift had got at least some of his information from what's called the Voynich manuscript. The Voynich manuscript is this sort of 200-plus page long document reputedly originated in the early 15th century. And it takes its name from the fact that it was actually sort of discovered or uncovered by a book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich, who was a Polish-Lithuanian person who he purchased it in 1912. Now, it's proved pretty much impossible to decipher it. Even the best code breakers of the National Security Agency have studied it. They can't break it.
Right.
And to demonstrate, we can prove it has been studied by the NSA. You can actually go to their website and download some of their papers on the Voynich manuscript. Some of them are extremely lengthy, how they tried to analyze it. So that's part of the story does stand up, that they did have a deep interest in it. But as I said, I interviewed one person for the book who said, well, Swift did manage to decipher part of it, and it related to ancient secrets on Mars. Now, the fact is that although the Voynich manuscript contains a lot of sort of botanical and biological descriptions and pictures and drawings, etc., it also has entire sections on astronomical and astrological phenomena relative to the moon, the planets, the stars, and the sun. So again, the fact that it has a relationship to astronomy, and we can prove that the NSA did study it, that kind of adds weight to this story that somebody found out within the NSA, that Swift had uncovered some ancient secret that clearly, been discovered thousands of years ago, but had later been lost. Now, on top of that, in the 1950s, the famous comic book artist Jack Kirby wrote a comic book series, the second part of which was called The Face on Mars. And it deals, bear in mind this was like 58, 59.
Right.
And this actually deals with a U.S. space mission to Mars, where when the astronauts land, they find this huge carved face on the surface of Mars, which when they go through the eye sockets, demonstrates as like a hidden Martian city beneath it. And Jack Kirby was someone who has sort of quasi connections to the CIA, where some of his artwork was used in a CIA sort of spy op situation in 1979 to get some of the American hostages out of Iran at the American embassy crisis. They actually went undercover of being part of a film crew, and some of Jack Kirby's artistic renditions that were sort of handed over to try and convince the Iranians, that this was they were just part of a film crew. They didn't really work at the embassy.
Right.
His artwork was used to help get them out. And he was also consulted on, potential ideas and drawings for jetpacks, for CIA agents. So it sounds bizarre, but, so you have this comic book artist with links to the CIA who 20 years before The Face on Mars even surfaces through NASA almost, writes a comic book story called The Face on Mars about this huge ancient carved face. And we find other people in the sci-fi realm who had ties to officialdom as well, writing novels all about pyramids on Mars. And of course, in Cydonia, where you have The Face on Mars, you also have these eerily pyramid-type structures. So, I sort of speculate in the book, is it possible that somebody in government uncovered some very ancient and archaic information about the face on Mars? And possibly, even in the 50s and that era, there was a subtle attempt perhaps to acclimatize and inform people of this, get them prepared for the idea that Mars isn't a dead world and that may have harbored life and may still harbor life. But it seems that by the end of the 50s, early 60s, this entire program had come to an end, and all this sort of talk of ancient mysteries conveniently surfacing today that eerily paralleled the past, it all came to an end. And it was almost, as I see it, kind of like a battle within the Pentagon, where some people wanted the truth to come out and others didn't. And those who didn't, I think, kind of won the day, so to speak.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, the passage of time, we can look back on that, and it just, the idea that it's a coincidence just doesn't really stand up, in my mind,
no, if it was one thing, we could say, well, yeah, but when you've got Jonathan Swift, Jack Kirby, all these other stories and cartoon series and TV programs all talking about pyramids and strange faces on Mars, then, when it gets to that point, and there's 7 or 8 different strands, all from different people, but all in one decade, you have to begin to wonder that did somebody in the government sort of subtly approach people in the sci-fi world and say, hey, can you put this out? We want to kind of spread it as like a modern day meme or something like that,
Right, exactly. And the idea, I could see cities on Mars as a potential sort of idea that crops up, but the whole idea of a carved face is so arcane and so, it's so unique that like I said, I find it hard to believe that it just sort of sprung from the imagination. And then ended up turning out to be something that may be true.
Well, that's the big thing. It's even Jack Kirby's picture itself looks like the face on Mars. That's the weird thing. So, if you Google that on Google Images, you'll see the main picture where you have this sort of carved face. Just eerily staring out from Mars. It's a cartoon picture, but when you see that it's actually titled "The Face on Mars" as well, it kind of. It's like what came first, truth or fiction.
Right, exactly, yeah. Now, you sort of ponder in the book, what it is that the government really knows about all this stuff, and you put forward the idea that maybe the government doesn't know as much as we think, and that kind of bears noting in the sense, because it's interesting that you get this idea, you hear about like Area 51 and stuff like that, and you imagine that they have like the best and the brightest people there trying to solve these mysteries, but then as you read the book, you find out that a lot of times they're turning to these alternative figures like Jessup and the ARC researcher and contactees and stuff to get their research. Like they co-opt the research of the New Age or the esoteric community, which, makes you almost think that they're fumbling around in the dark trying to figure this out as much as we are.
Well, I think actually several things, Tim. I think, the older the mystery is, the harder and harder it becomes to find the answers because it's so old. It's kind of like investigating a murder case that occurred 24 hours ago versus 24 years ago. Forensics for the police, it's kind of a similar thing with the intelligence community and these ancient mysteries. But what I would say is that, when it comes to sort of the brightest and the best, I think one of the reasons why, sort of the most high-profile figures in sort of scientific communities don't get enlisted into these programs is because the government probably astutely realizes, a lot of them have big egos because they do a lot of TV and stuff like that, and they'd want to blow the whistle. I'm the guy who's working on the crashed UFO,
Right.
I'm the one who's working on the remains of Noah's Ark.
Yeah, they want credit for it, yeah.
Yeah, they want credit. They want, the next Nobel Prize or whatever. And so I think government agencies do really astutely realize there's no way we can get this guy, who's on the History Channel every other week into the program because he's just going to shoot his mouth off. And I think what they also do, so they get people who are very brilliant and clever, but are kind of alternative, a little bit wacky, even maybe like a mad scientist type. But equally, they're people who they can knock down and discredit if they want to, if these guys do go public. A perfect example, is somebody who was sort of a maverick scientist who people say, well, there's no way he'd be brought into a program like this. Is somebody like Bob Lazar.
I was just going to say Bob Lazar, yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I actually don't write off Lazar. People say, well, he didn't have all these official, letters after his name or whatever. But the thing is, sitting in a classroom for years doesn't always, give you the experience that being thrown in the deep end in the real world does. You know what I mean? It's like you can spend 3 years in a classroom being told how to swim, but the best thing to do is somebody push you in the back and knock you in the swimming pool, and you'll start swimming,
Exactly.
It's kind of like that. And I think with people like Lazar, I don't write him off because there are enough strands to his story that suggest, he was plugged into the official world at places like Los Alamos. I think people are brought in who they do good profiles on them. They know that they've got solid information. They can think outside the box. They're not restricted by, just this sort of almost like indoctrinated college, university mindset.
Right.
But also there are things in their background or whatever that can be used against them if they do decide to sort of, run their mouth off or whatever. And I think that's why in some of these stories, I talk about when the military, for example, in the 50s and 60s was trying to find out the truth about, were the pyramids built by levitation or anti-gravity. They approached people like Morris Jessup. He was a doctor. He wrote UFO books, but he had traveled out to Central and South America investigating and studying these huge, massive blocks of stone, etc., and pondering on how they were built and moved. And they flew him out to D.C. and, interviewed him and paid all his expenses, his hotel fee, his flight, a lot. And, they weren't approaching, some guy in the Pentagon who may have been researching this or that, or they may have done, but equally they were actually sort of making clandestine approaches to people in the UFO community who they felt might be willing to talk to them and open a few doors as well. So.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, too, sort of in that regard, and you make note of it in the book, and it's something that I've kind of heard, I guess you could say, mentioned on the side, or I don't want to say whispered, but sort of alluded to in the past from people who look at the UFO question, and that is just sort of the power or the influence or the interest of the Navy, how the Navy is sort of like this unspoken player in this whole milieu of conspiracy and research of the unknown and sort of an underreported or underrated sort of factor in a lot of this. So I'm sure you've kind of heard this idea bandied about.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting because we do find strands of Navy interest or deep Navy interest in a lot of these mysteries. I mean, a classic one is the pyramids. You know, the thing I talk about in the book. You know, they're all cultures around the world that have, you know, massive, monuments like the pyramids of Egypt or the similar ones in South America, Central America, or a lot of the ancient Greek and Roman massive formations, or Stonehenge in England. They all have rumors and legends that, you know, rather than being built by sort of rollers, ropes, pulleys, etc., that these pyramids were built, you know, by some, you know, fantastic source that was able to elevate them in the air, you know, and basically what today we would call levitation or, you know, anti-gravity, that kind of thing. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at a lot of these old legends, this comes to the Navy, which I'll get to, they all have very sort of intriguing stories attached to them. If you take them literally, you know, they make no sense. But, you know, they talk about how the stones were supposedly moved to sort of magical tunes or to musical instruments or, you know, magical flutes and sort of, paranormal songs and things like that. Yeah. You know, it was a situation where music and sound seemed to play a role in the movement of these massive blocks, and that the ancients seem to know something about it. Now, today, that's actually very close to what's basically known as acoustic levitation, which is being researched more and more. And it's kind of, you know, a complex thing, but in simple terms, it's where you have sort of two opposing sound frequencies with what are called interfering sound waves, and they create what's called a resonance zone. And inside that resonance zone, if you sort of amplify and control that those sound frequencies that are sort of opposing, you can actually lift objects within that resonance zone. And the military's had some success at doing that. Granted, they're only sort of managed to lift small objects so far, but, you know, using sound to lift stone blocks today, or small objects today, you know, you can easily understand how over sort of centuries of oral tradition passed down from family to family, say, you know, in the Middle East, how acoustic levitation could be, you know, sort of mangled into magical music. You see what I mean?
Exactly, yeah.
Now, what's interesting is that at the forefront of all this research into, like, acoustic levitation in the 50s was not, as you might think, the Air Force, you know, because they were doing a lot of the UFO programs or whatever, like Blue Book and Grudge, or the CIA with the Robertson panel. It was actually the Navy. And it was the Navy who took all this deep interest in Morris Jessup, who, you know, was sort of a hands-on person who went out to South America and Central America. And, you know, I think with hindsight, probably one of the reasons why Jessup was singled out was simply because, you know, he'd actually done the research on site. You know, he wasn't just stuck in some library doing theoretical work. So he was flown out and basically grilled and interviewed or interrogated about his research. You know, why he felt that the pyramids were built by some sort of levitation, how did it work, you know, who was responsible for it, etc., etc. You know, and what was interesting is that the people that were interviewing him were actually attached to like a special technology, special weapons division. And so, in other words, this is one of the things I think runs through the theme of these stories and the book, the idea that the people at an official level were sort of digging into the past to try and weaponize the past in the present, if you like. You know, they were trying to understand these technologies to see if there was some sort of spin-off that could be utilized in today's world. And I think, you know, they clearly recognize that ancient man possessed technologies very different to ours, highly alternative, you know, that may not even sort of relied on nuts and bolts, mechanics and plugs and electricity or something, but a far more alternative technology, but, you know, that was equally, if not even more effective in certain ways, you know, particularly when it comes to moving these huge stones. I mean, like the one at Baalbek in the Middle East, that weighs in at just around about 1,000 tons. You know, it's like, and we're supposed to, you know, we're told it it was moved by roll, or, it could be moved by rollers or whatever. It's just not feasible.
Right. I think they just say that and hope people will just stop asking questions. It's kind of...
Yeah, I mean, the thing is as well, a lot of these landscapes where these stones are moved, it's not like they're just flat, which would make it even easier. You're talking about up and down hills, sand. It's like you'd have a hard time getting your car out the sand, if it's sunk into the, you forgot your car was left on the beach or something. Never mind moving however many tons to build a pyramid,
Yeah, exactly. Now, we're going to move on into final events in a moment, but let me just sort of plug this book again. The Pyramids in the Pentagon. There's other stuff we didn't even get into, folks. Vimanas, the Indian Vimanas, and how they may have influenced the atomic research of the 40s and 50s, and crop circles and Stonehenge and a whole bunch of other stuff of the ancient mysterious nature, and I guess modern mysterious in a way with crop circles. And having read this book, I wanted to make a suggestion / request for you, since I presume maybe you probably get a lot of book suggestion requests, but this one, maybe you've already kind of looked at this, but I would like to see a Pyramids and the Pentagon style book, but looking at Bigfoot and cryptids. Sort of looking at maybe what the government interest in these mysterious beasts has been over the years. Is there much to that
funny
idea?
You should mention that.
Okay, well,
funny you should mention that. I've actually got a huge amount of information on that, and for years I've been sort of considering doing it. I've just never got round to it. But I mean, it's, there's no secret to it. I mean, I've got, for example, Freedom of Information files on Navy sightings of sea serpents, British government files on big cat sightings, stuff about the State Department being interested in the Yeti, things from Puerto Rico about official interest in the Chupacabra. So I guess I'll probably have to do it one day. It sounds like, the idea is sort of spinning around. Maybe that's sort of, somebody's way of telling me to, do it.
Yeah. I would love that. I would just be all over that. So, like I said, we're going to move into a different book now, but this one here is The Pyramids and the Pentagon. That's from New Page Books, folks. Go out and pick that up. And the other book I want to talk to you about, and it came out a couple of years ago, and I know you did a ton of interviews about it, but I finally got the chance to really sit down and dig into it, and that is Final Events and the Secret Government Group on Demonic UFOs and the Afterlife, and that's from Anomalist Books. And I got to tell you, Nick, this book not only was just terrifying in a lot of ways, but it really was one of the most fascinating and enjoyable UFO books I've read in quite some time. It was really mind-blowing in a lot of ways and made me look at the whole phenomenon from a whole different angle. So, I mean, kudos to you for really putting this out there.
No, well, thanks. I mean, it is one of it's probably without doubt the most controversial book I've written. And it is one that, you used a word that a lot of people have used, which is sort of terrifying, because it has a story that, is pretty unsettling, if true. It's a book that, I realized had to be sort of written in a certain way, where I pointed out from the beginning that these are the conclusions, theories, and ideas of a group in government, and this is how they came to believe this and why they came to believe it, rather than Nick Redfern saying, hey, the sky's about to fall in on us, this is what's going on. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. No, I have that.
That was an important, yeah.
I was going to say, I have that in my notes here, that right in the introduction you say, this is what I've been told and what I've researched, not what I believe, which is, Yeah,
and I think that's an important point, I mean, not that an author shouldn't I stand by the story in the sense that I wanted to write the book because it's fascinating to find that a group in government was getting funding to look at the ideas that UFOs had sort of occult, demonic origins. Does that mean they do? I don't know, but the fact that a government group was looking into it is a story that's worth telling. So that's basically, how I approach the story. But, I mean, the origins of the story, people often ask me, well, how is it you actually uncover the story? Don't you think it's suspicious that this sort of group approached you? But it didn't actually happen like that. What happened was that a few years ago, I think 2007 now, I interviewed a guy named Ray Boucher. Ray's a former MUFON state director. He lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. And back in the 80s, he did a lot of research into the Rendlesham Forest case and even tried to get his senator or congressman involved. I forget which one it was now, but it was one of the two. Mm-hmm. And I was doing some research on Rendlesham and, wanted to speak to Ray because he apparently had interviewed two Pentagon guys, two scientists or physicists who were apparently knew something about Rendlesham. And so, Ray related this to me about how he'd met them at this hotel in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I thought that was going to be the end of the story, that they were two physicists from the Pentagon who were sort of working on this Rendlesham program or knew something about it. But that was sort of just a minor part of the story. Ray said, well, there's actually a far bigger part to it. They were actually, he said, researching the overall UFO phenomenon and had come to the conclusion that, all the sort of significant cases actually had nothing to do with alien visitation, but they viewed it as like a satanic deception. The idea that a lot of these incidents were sort of staged and possibly even like hologram based, it was instilled in the witness's mind that we were seeing aliens, when in other words, it was like a demonic deception to allow sort of, the Antichrist and Satan himself to get his grips into us, but under the guise of like an alien, I won't say invasion, but like an alien presence.
Right, yeah.
And then we'd fall for the ruse one day when the aliens come down and land, and it's actually, paving the way for Armageddon or whatever.
Right.
And, I was like, wow, so they're basically saying, that UFOs are sort of like a biblical prophecy, a fulfilling of prophecies, the final battle between good and evil, and it's going to be carried out under the guise of like a UFO invasion. And Ray said, yes, that's what they concluded. So this, it became an even bigger story for me. And Ray said, he told me the background, how he met these guys, how they'd phone him, how the meetings went ahead, etc. And there are a few things he asked me not to include, which I didn't, and which I haven't spoken about. And well, it was just some minor things, a few names and stuff that, on a couple of occasions helped me sort of pursue the story further.
Right.
And it opened a few doors where I actually was able to sort of put feelers out, which is what I often do. If you get stuck, well, you just, you have to pick the phone up and just phone some public affairs office and say, hey, I'm a journalist, I've been given this story, will you comment on it? And often it's like, well, no comment, or we think it's this, or it's that,
Yeah.
Like with Roswell, when the mogul balloon story came out, I phoned them up to get a quote on that, and they said, well, our comment is it's a mogul balloon. Sometimes that's where it ends. With this one, I actually got a phone call back. This was like under really weird sort of like deep throat type sources where it was, we understand you've spoken to Mr. Beauchet and he's related ABC or whatever. What's your interest? Why are you interested in taking it further? And I just, what did I have to lose by sort of playing it straight? I said, it's a fascinating story. From a journalistic perspective,
absolutely, yeah.
Group in Pentagon investigates demonic UFOs and gets funding from the government is a great story. And it was like, oh, okay. And then, then it was like, well, thank you very much, Mr. Redfern, for letting us know, And then down the line, I got sort of like a couple of other follow-ups, which allowed me to meet not many of the people from the group. It's not like, I got some tour of some headquarters or anything like that. Nothing like that ever happened. It was like 5 people who, several of whom were retired and now, elderly, and a couple who may have still been tied to it or may have sort of recently sort of left, so to speak, told me about this group, which went internally, they had a nickname for it, which was the Collins Elite. But whether or not it had an official name, I think it probably did, but I think it's kind of like, with the CIA, its unofficial name, its nickname is the company. But there isn't a group within the CIA called the company, within the government called the company. It's called the Central Intelligence Agency.
Right.
But it's known as the company. And I think that could be the case with the Collins Elite, that it's like an unofficial nickname that they use or have used to avoid revealing what is probably a still classified title. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But they basically sort of went right back to the early stages, like Kenneth Arnold, Roswell, right through the 50s, the contactees, the abduction movements, and came away believing that, there were enough strands suggesting that it could all be traced back to demonic activity. And, you know, the extraterrestrial guys was the latest motif. You know, they believe that these things had sort of disguised themselves in the past as everything from, like, goblins, jinns, fairies, you know, the whole sort of
elemental type things.
Yeah, you know, the whole paranormal creatures in the past, you know, that were sort of relevant to the people of that era, you know, that and their culture and their mythology, they would manifest according to those cultural beliefs. And because we believe in aliens, that's their latest incarnation, if you like. But they believe that this was the last one, you know, building up to this sort of final deception and attack, if you like, is probably a good term to use. And so then it was a case of, well, why do you believe this? And, you know, digging into the different cases or whatever.
Yeah. And like I said, I really enjoyed this book because, to be quite honest, and I mean, the demonic UFO theory has been out there all over the place for a very long time, and quite frankly, I've dismissed it out of hand up until now, up until I read this book. And if somebody had asked me sort of like the top 10 possibilities for UFOs, the demonic theory really would be like 9, 10 are off the list for me. But having read this, I gotta say, it's really pushed, it's given a lot of credence to the possibility of it. And I guess that's where the terrifying part comes in, because
I agree with you. I think the big issue is how you interpret what a demon is. You know, I think the one problem that I think, or fault, that the Collins elite had was not following the idea that it's not extraterrestrial, but it's something else. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think there is good evidence we're dealing with a phenomenon that may not be extraterrestrial. It may be from some other realm of existence, you know, or dimensional portal, or whatever you want to term it. And you could argue that, you know, from the biblical sense, that maybe heaven and hell are other dimensions, you know what I mean?
Right, exactly, yeah. But, like you're saying, maybe they followed it to too literal an interpretation of the Bible.
Yeah, if they'd have said, we don't think it's extraterrestrial, but we think it's from some other realm, that is, to me, is far more likely than saying, we don't think it's extraterrestrial, we literally think it's demons from hell. Right. That is the conclusion they came to. And I think I do think they took it too literally, but I do think they probably were right on target by saying it probably is something that coexists with us rather than travel in linear star system to linear star system or whatever, you know. It's, I truly do believe, you know, these phenomena are sort of coexist with us, you know, in other realms or window areas, as John Keel used to call them, you know, these portal points to other forms of existence. But in saying that, you know, there are classic examples where you can find in some of the sort of most formative and famous UFO cases links directly back to the certain same people over and over again. One of the people that the Collins elite believed sort of kick-started all this was Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was a brilliant rocket scientist, sort of really got going in the 1930s. And he created the Aerojet Corporation, which actually made the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle program, for NASA's space shuttle program. And he was one of the main brains behind the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California. And every year, on Halloween of all nights, the JPL actually celebrate Parsons' life, and they reel out these mannequins of Parsons and all his early cohorts. And this was a man who, before every rocket mission, would invoke the god Pan to try and have a successful flight. You know, and he was working with what would become eventually one day NASA. He had a top-secret clearance with the Army, the Air Force, and various other missile-based, groups doing missile-based research and rocketry research. And he was basically an occultist. He was a disciple of none other than Aleister Crowley. And Parsons himself actually claimed to have engaged in various sort of incantations and rituals that he said opened a portal and doorway to let the flying saucers through in the modern era. Now, we can go back to Crowley, who he took all his inspiration from. In the 1910s, Crowley engaged on this sort of long-term ritual called the Alamantra Working, which basically was where he invoked or conjured up this being known as Lam, L-A-M, which I reproduced Crowley's picture of it in the book. Yeah. Almost, apart from the huge eyes, but it still has penetrating eyes. It almost looks like the classic figure on the face of Whitley Strieber's Communion.
Yeah, it's like a great.
You know, so we have Crowley in like 1918 conjuring up this creature or entity called Lamb from some other realm of existence. Then you have Parsons following him and claimed to have opened the doorway to flying saucers. And this is in 1947 when he was engaged in a bunch of weird rituals. Now, what's interesting is that Parsons was big friends with a lot of the people in the 1940s science fiction movement. One of the people he was heavily linked up to was Ray Palmer, who was the editor of Amazing Stories. And Parsons actually met Ray Palmer. Ray Palmer was actually the publisher and co-author of Kenneth Arnold's The Coming of the Saucers. So in other words, the man who was responsible for coining the term flying saucers, pretty much, Kenneth Arnold, and his book, you know, could be traced back to Ray Palmer, who co-wrote it, who was friends with Jack Parsons, who took his inspiration from Aleister Crowley. You know, so you have like a lineage from Crowley right through to the man who defined what flying saucers were. You know, that's just one of many sort of such weird, you know, examples I talk about in the book.
Right. Parsons is a fascinating figure. A couple things stood out to me from reading the book. I couldn't believe. Obviously, this is just a straight up fact, but I didn't even know this, that he was only 37 when he died. So I mean, talk about. I feel inadequate. I feel inadequate seeing like these young people doing amazing things. I'm only 33. This guy opened a portal to possibly open a portal to hell, and he was practically my age probably when he did it. So I got to get on the ball.
I mean, yeah. Well, it was one of these situations, you know, where he was a brilliant maverick alternative scientist, and this is a classic example of how the military doesn't mind working with somebody like that if they can get the job done. You know, as I said, he was an occultist. He was a follower of Crowley. You know, he engaged actually in sort of rituals with none other than L. Ron Hubbard. You know, the brains behind Scientology. You know, he was friends with him for a while. They had a falling out, but, you know, at one point they were friends and close colleagues. But as I said, you know, he invoked Pan before a flight, you know, rocket flight, and the military just kind of rolled their eyes and said, well, if he gets the job done, it doesn't really matter. That was kind of the approach. And he had a top secret clearance, literally, you know, top secret with countless agencies. And he, unfortunately, blew himself up in his lab in 52. There were a lot of rumors. He was trying to conjure up a creature known as a homunculus. And in ancient folklore, this is like it's actually described as a small little man endowed with magical powers. And if you see some of the drawings of the homunculus from centuries ago, it looks like a little grey. It's like a little doll-like bald-headed figure, you know, and the story is he was trying to conjure one of these up when he blew himself up or possibly opened another portal and this sort of negative backlash came through. But, you know, this was 52. Also in 52, you know, he had the rise of people like George Adamski. That's when his Flying Saucers of Landed book came out. Well, Adamski's co-author was a man named Desmond Leslie, who came from a very famous and rich, an aristocratic Irish family. And one of Desmond Leslie's relatives, Sir Shane Leslie, was a devotee of Aleister Crowley. You know, so you've got Crowley to Sir Shane Leslie to Desmond Leslie, who was George Adamski's co-author. So, you know, regardless of what people think about George Adamski, you know, he was without doubt one of the biggest names in 1950s ufology. And in the same way that Kenneth Arnold, you know, has sort of like a link back to Crowley via Ray Palmer, so Adamski has a link back to Crowley through his co-author Desmond Leslie. You know, so there's a lot of things through the 50s that, you know, never mind just the 40s.
Exactly, yeah. It's like there's these occult connections in the early days of the UFO phenomenon that you're sort of, that, you know, are brought to light here. That makes, again, it makes you sort of question, you know, this like you said earlier, for lack of a better term, demonic aspect of it all. I thought it was interesting in the book, and I'm wondering if this ever sort of came up in your conversations with these people you talked to, it's obviously very dark and everything, and if they're interpreting it literally in the sense that they think these are demons from Satan's, at the behest of Satan, where are all the good angels? Like, where are all the good things that should be happening? It seems like, I kind of was wondering that along the way. They're sort of waiting for the final battle, but it's odd.
You're right. I mean, that is a good point. I have no answer for that. All I can, sort of talk about is what the group came to conclude. And as I point out, I think their big flaw is not just interpreting things literally, but not straying away from that point of view. Anything that was to do with portals and doorways, they didn't perceive it as being interdimensional or some of the realm that, kind of coexisted with us that could be explained scientifically. They explained it supernaturally as a portal to literally like the fiery pit and this guy, with a forked tail and a pitchfork or whatever. And I think had they sort of thought outside of that specifically just religious approach and said, well, hey, maybe whatever the occult is, it can actually open portals and doorways. There actually is good evidence that, sort of meditating or altered states and things like this can open portals, things like DMT, for example. A lot of research has been done where that seems to invoke abduction-type experiences or close encounters where your mind literally hooks into some of the realm of existence. And had they gone down that path as well and just been open-minded more, I think they would have achieved a great deal more than just having this blinkered approach that, no, this is coming from the literal hell and nowhere else,
Right, exactly. It's like these dark entities, they may have no religious affiliation. They may, they may come through this portal and just be like, we just hate humans. Yeah, that's all we hate
we
humans.
can never deny the possibility, that the stories of heaven and hell are distorted versions of the ancients actually fully being aware that there were other realms of existence and that there were negative entities in some of them, and that if you knew the right way, you could invoke them. I actually do believe that's all possible, but that doesn't mean it's a literal place where one's all fluffy and cloudy and harps and the other one's people being pushed into some fiery pit.
Right.
That's such a simplistic interpretation of what could be multi-dimensions,
Exactly, yeah.
Do you think people will vote for me?
Heck yes, I'd vote for you.
Like, what are my skills?
Well, you have a sweet bike, and you're really good at hooking up with chicks. Plus, you're like the only guy at school who has a mustache.
That's true.
You're listening to Banal of America Audio.
If you vote for me, all of your wildest dreams will come true.
Now, I thought it was interesting. I'm going to kiss your ass here a little bit again because, the whole story of Roswell has been just beaten to death so many times. And you here, Nick Redfern, you've introduced two new theories to the Roswell crash in the last decade. You've got the body snatchers in the desert theory, and then in this book there's a whole nother idea that, that this is alchemical material that is sprinkled in the New Mexico desert by the nefarious dark forces, if you will. So there's no real question behind this in a sense, just sort of a celebration that you're adding some new stuff to the Roswell story.
Well, Roswell, the biggest problem about Roswell isn't, the fact that we have one or two theories suggesting something strange happened. It's that we have so many theories, and it's kind of like when it gets to saturation point, then it becomes difficult to know what the truth is. And, you mentioned I wrote a book called Body Snatchers in the Desert back in 2005, which was basically, a study of the idea of was Roswell a military experiment, that went wrong and it was covered up because it was sort of a dubious sort of high-altitude experiment using people. But the Collins elite had what I would actually say is like a unique approach, which I truthfully never, ever contemplated or considered. They viewed Roswell as like a Trojan horse. They don't believe anything literally crashed in the form of an accident at Roswell. They believed it was like a deliberately staged event. And they believe that basically, as the literal interpretation, that demons don't have a literal form. A lot of people are surprised about this, but the official story, or not the official story, the religious view is that, demons are without form, although, some people believe they can take on sort of a physical appearance, if you like.
Right.
But the Collins elite came to believe that these entities were able to sort of alchemically almost manipulate matter. So, they would pluck matter and created the so-called memory metal found at Roswell. And as you point out, like kind of literally sprinkled it onto the New Mexico desert floor to create the image in our minds of a crash. And they believe that they did the same thing with the bodies. They believe that the bodies never lived. They were almost like, they were dummies, but not crash test dummies. They were like dummies made of, what we would call flesh, blood, bone, DNA, but again, which have been sort of alchemically manipulated. Kind of like, if you take the imagery of like a jackalope, a jackalope's this sort of created creature, you can buy in stores that never really lived, but it's made up of bone, blood, DNA, etc.
Right.
But it's taken from different animals. They kind of believe that. The idea that, that these were constructed life forms designed to lull the U.S. military into a false sense of security that vulnerable aliens had crashed, like a typical Trojan horse scenario. Now, as I said, what's interesting is that Jack Parsons tried to himself conjure up one of these creatures known as a homunculus, where it's basically like a manufactured life form that, you instill life in it, but it never really lived, so to speak.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that one of Parsons' colleagues, who was almost a father figure to him, named Theodore von Karman, who also in a roundabout way was linked with manufactured life forms. Von Karman had a relative hundreds of years ago who was obsessed with golems. The golem in, Jewish traditions, again, is like this manufactured creature. And the fact that von Karman, believed in the golem story, is an adherent of the story. And he was working with Jack Parsons, who was trying to conjure up or create manufactured life forms. And then we find the Collins elite thinks that the bodies found at Roswell were manufactured life forms. We see another strand here as well. And what's even more interesting is that a guy who was sort of not so much an ally, but a semi-friendly rival of Parsons was Robert Goddard, who moved his rockets programs to Roswell. And Jack Parsons in the late 30s, early 40s actually went out to Roswell to discuss rocketry with Goddard. So, we have Parsons actually out at Roswell, which, again takes the story to an even deeper level, if you like.
Now, in the, I guess you could say in the mythos of the history of ufology, where do you think, and maybe this came up with the guys from the Collins Elite, maybe it didn't, but I'm sure you've thought about this, I hope. What's the situation, what's the relationship between the Collins Elite and whatever faction would be the MJ-12? Whether we, obviously may not go by that name, but there seems to be an idea that there's a government, group looking at UFOs. What was the relationship between those two potential groups?
Well, actually that's a very good question, Tim, because it's important we understand sort of the nature of this group. I think what I got pretty quickly, and I think is absolutely correct, is that this isn't some sort of all-powerful CIA-type agency, or even something like MJ-12. The Collins Elite is not the group that is sitting on the big secret. I mean, they talk about Roswell. A lot of the material, I reproduced sort of the text of an intriguing but, a document that isn't ultimately verifiable yet. It didn't surface through the Freedom of Information Act. A lot of the material they talk about in there, their reference section is open source literature, like the Moore Berlitz book on the Roswell incident, or Kevin Randall's books, etc. The Collins Elite, to me, don't come across like, the guys who are sitting on the big secret. They were like 1 or 2 levels down. They were sort of a think tank group that, okay, there may be somebody who's really sitting on a big secret, but we want to get other people's inputs as well in case, the all-powerful group have actually got it wrong. And so the Collins Elite seem to be like a second or third tier type think tank that had access to some insider secrets. That's clear, because they clearly reference a number of reports on Roswell that, if they are real, remain classified and go far beyond balloons and crash test dummies. But they don't seem to have been cleared to have actually seen the bodies or handled the wreckage. They got information that they were cleared to access to a certain degree. And they do come across more like a funded think tank rather than the guys pulling the strings, and
Right.
I think that's an important factor that, that's how government agencies work. All the work isn't done by, the top dog, so to speak. The top dog sort of assigns programs and projects to sort of sub-projects, and they aren't always clear to know why they're collecting the information they're being asked to collect or ordered to collect. And I think that applies here, that the Collins elite knew a great deal that we don't know. There's no doubt about that, and they uncovered a lot of data that, we don't have access to. But it was passed, I think, further up the chain, and they may not even have known what was done with it,
Right. I think in the part you're talking about that references the open source text, I think even in that, it's a piece written by someone in the Collins elite, and it sounds like they're sort of bemoaning some group above them that has like an indecipherable, like 3-4 letter name that is just like 4 letters.
No, you're absolutely right. I actually talk about this a couple of times when, they were interested in abductions. They felt abductions were like a holographic imagery instilled in the mind of the witness to try and convince, that they'd been abducted by aliens. But it was like a blanketing of the population, of almost like a Matrix-type insertion into people's minds with no physical reality to it. And they were bemoaning the fact that, well, we need more funding to investigate this. If they were the top dog, they wouldn't be complaining that, our abduction project needs to be revamped and kick-started, So, again, I see several strands like that throughout the book. It's not all the time, but consistently from 52, when they sort of pretty much really kicked off formally, through the 80s, when the abduction project kicked off big time, or to a larger degree, and then with Roswell, there are inferences in all these different aspects where they were like, we need more money, we need more funding. Why is this group, getting access to this and we're not, And to me, that makes the story more credible. If they were claiming to know the answers to everything and being the top thing, I'd be like, well, this is just too smoothly presented to me, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But having a think tank group that actually was complaining about funding and budgets and believing there was people above them who knew more, that is the way government works, and that made it, come across to me as far more believable and acceptable, that it wasn't some sort of disinformation ploy or whatever.
Yeah. And again, to sort of like strip the religious connotations away from the story in a sense, but also to look at what the story, the root of the story, if you will. I thought it was really troubling and interesting that this whole thing sort of hinges on the harvesting of souls. Because, and even you point out in the book that it's like impossible to really get to the bottom of what the soul is. It's like this intangible thing that great minds throughout history have tried to elucidate more. And I've heard this theory endlessly, really, about the harvesting of souls. So it sounds like there must be something, I don't know, not necessarily to the idea of the harvesting of souls, but there's got to be something going on that is at the root of this. Do you know what I mean? It feels, it resonates.
Yeah, this actually sort of eerily, in a way, parallels, the Matrix saga. In the movies, the real world that we think we all live in, when we get stuck in traffic or watch TV, it's like an image, it's a dream, but a highly sophisticated dream. And really, we're all, millions of us or billions of us, we're all in these pods making electricity for the machines in the Matrix. That's the basic theme of the movie, or the movies. And the Collins elite had a similar scenario. They believe that the reason why, these entities have never sort of landed on the White House lawn or destroyed us is because they don't want to do either. They want to maintain us. The Collins elite kind of viewed us as like a herd, like the cattle. And the idea is that, the cattle blissfully eat and munch the grass in the fields, and the farmer feeds them, and as far as they're concerned, he's their friend,
Yeah.
He brings food and water every day and gives them somewhere to sleep at night. But then the day comes, when they're taken away and they're slaughtered for food, and then their eyes are open as to what their fate is. Well, the Collins elite believed that the earth was like that. It was like a huge farm. We were the herd. And that when we get taken, at the point of death, what happens, they believe, was that these entities. Now, this isn't in the Bible, I should stress this. The Collins elite actually sort of mutated some of the old beliefs and came up with their own ideas based on the stuff that they said they uncovered as time went on. Mm-hmm. They believe that these entities, that some people would call demons, literally live on soul energy. So, in other words, they want to maintain the human race until a point where the biblical prophecies have to be fulfilled regardless. But they viewed it that, they take energy as a food source from the human soul. And so, in other words, we're harvested, when we die, it's the equivalent to the cows being taken to the slaughterhouse, we're harvested for our souls. And it was described as like almost like a scientific situation, where these sort of entire soul factories almost, in some other realm of existence. And that is probably the one thing, more than anything else in the book really does sort of disturb people, the idea that the planet is like a farm, But what's interesting is that there probably aren't hardly any abduction researchers who haven't been told this by at least more than a handful of abductees, John Mack talked about it a lot. Whitley Strieber did. Whitley Strieber said that some of the entities, or one of the entities he conversed with or was confronted with, was told, we recycle souls. Bob Lazar said, the files he supposedly read at Area 51 described us as containers. The idea that we were just the container for something more important. And if that is true, it's kind of like it'd be kind of really ironic, if if we're just some huge farm, you know what I mean? So.
Yeah, you wonder if it's like, if the soul's like a floppy disk and it just goes through the human body and you die and whatever these things are, take it and eat all the memory. Maybe that's what powers them, and then they just stick a fresh, they take all the stuff off the disk, put it back in the next person, and, it's spooky. Yeah. It's just the whole thing.
It is. I'd be the first to admit, they admitted this was a theory, but, it was a theory born out of the fact that a considerable number of people in the abduction field, regardless of how much they promote it or not, many of them do have those type of stories. I cite pretty much all the famous, well-known abductees in that particular chapter of the book, where they'd all, pretty much got stories along those lines. Whether they accepted them or not, it's a different thing, but abductees were telling them that, they felt these things were sort of literally stealing their soul, like a psychic vampire or something like that.
Yeah, it's spooky. What I really found interesting about this book, too, like I said, I really couldn't put it down and was just fascinated by it because it has so many twists on the classic UFO milieu. There's the Roswell thing we talked about, and then later on in the book, this thing with my labs, which is military abductions, which is a whole new branch, you could say, of abduction research that posits the idea that the government is following up alien abductions with their own abductions to, I guess, as I said to Melinda Leslie a long time ago, reverse engineer these abductees to figure out what they saw and everything. And then, as you put forward in the book, the Collins elite looked at my labs and couldn't come up with anything to prove them within the secret confines of the government, if you will, and then concluded that the MyLabs are also part of this grand illusion, which is insane.
They kind of concluded that the whole, everything from MyLabs to the black helicopters and abductions, that it was all part of like a massively sophisticated sort of simulation, projected into the mind of the person while they slept or whatever, and that it was being deliberately done all across the nation or the world to sort of promote and prompt, the meme idea of what alien abductions are supposed to be, get people. So everybody, and arguably, whether people believe it or not, everybody knows what the term alien abduction means today. That's a fact. People do. You could ask them in England, France, Germany, Australia, America, Canada, what's an alien abduction scenario, and they would tell you. So arguably that meme has spread. But yeah, it was weird that the Collins elite basically said, well, we've got this abduction group, and all we've got is like telephones, resources to review books and, a few documents or whatever. Yet there's this other group got access to helicopters and underground bases in fortified desert locations. And the government said, well, no, we're not doing that. And when the Collins elite themselves went looking, they couldn't find anything. And then they came to this idea, well, maybe this is all part of the simulation as well, and there is no MyLab, it's all part of this entire ruse.
Yeah, like I said, so many twists on the UFO story that as you're going along, it makes you take a whole other look at this entire phenomenon, which is
well. The interesting thing is as well that even if we take people say, well, how do we know this isn't disinformation? One of the reasons why I think it isn't is because we can actually find evidence of where stories like this have surfaced before, but you can take them sort of with new light and new appreciation with the Collins elite angle. For example, in 1973, there was a very famous UFO encounter at a place called Mansfield, Ohio, involving a helicopter crew piloted by a captain named Captain Coyne, where they had an extremely close encounter with a UFO as they were in the skies, and it affected the helicopter's engines, all sorts of stuff. Very famous case. And in the aftermath, the crew reported how, they get these weird phone calls from the Pentagon asking if they'd had any weird dreams about leaving their body or dying and feeling their soul leaving the body. This is the sort of stuff that the Collins elite were heavily influenced by and interested in. And these guys went on record years ago saying, we got these weird phone calls of people asking us about soul separation in relation to this UFO event, which sounds, although they weren't told, they were from the Collins elite, but that sounds exactly like what that group would have been doing then. So.
Yeah. Very weird. Now, I'm dying to know, because the book came out a couple of years ago, or maybe about 18 months ago or so. Have you learned anything more? Have more people come forward? I mean, is there any sort of general update on this Collins elite research? Because, up until this book came out, I talk about you adding 2 new theories to the Roswell crash. I mean, you've added a whole new batch of characters in a sense. You've sort of added a new MJ-12, as we already kind of talked about. So, I mean, this thing could go on forever looking at this group. Yeah, I mean,
certain things have come forward. I mean, for example, a few more corroborative stories like the Captain Coyne one, where things I hadn't thought about, where somebody pointed out, well, this sounds like these guys as well, that kind of thing. I also got hold of some documents talking about how the CIA back in the 50s were heavily researching Ouija boards. One of the people the Collins elite was interested in was a contactee named George Hunt Williamson, who claimed to have contacted aliens by Ouija boards. Now we're finding that very same area the CIA was interested in Ouija boards. I've got a few things like that. And I've got a few more revelations, no pun intended, from the people I previously interviewed. But unfortunately, now whether this, should be viewed suspiciously as, sort of a manipulation or not, I don't know. But no more members of the group have come forward. Now, whether that means this was like a testing of the waters and there's been a decision taken not to take it any further, or, for all I know, maybe they've gone on to somebody else, and next week, there's going to be a new book that nobody's been told about because it's been kept under wraps, do you know what I mean? And somebody else has spoken to members of the group. I think that's a possibility. So, the very fact that, because this story, I got it from Ray Boucher, and it wasn't like one that was spoon-fed to me, it was one I sort of stumbled on, and then somebody said, well, okay, we'll share a few things. It wasn't like, I discovered all this stuff hidden away in some archive. So I think in many respects, the good argument can be made they were the ones pulling the strings, which I have to admit is true. This wasn't a case of me, unfortunately, being in control of the situation. It was the exact opposite. And that relates to how the data was given to me as well. So I think that possibly explains, why I've made some headway in some areas. In other ways, unfortunately, I haven't. I wish I could say I'm in the position to write final events too, but I'm not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, yeah.
I mean, I wish I could. I wish I could add another 100 pages to the Parsons angle, or to the Adamski angle, or to the Soul angle, but I can't. I've got snippets. But it wouldn't surprise me because, they spoke to Ray Boucher in 91. They corresponded, or elements of them corresponded with Linda Howe in I think it was 94 or 93. And then I had this sort of contact 2009, 2010, that era, 2008. And so for that reason, I think, there could well be other people who are going to take it to another level.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of this is testing the waters to see what the response is, and so there's been snippets, but nothing where I wish I could say there's been some huge thing that there hasn't, unfortunately. So.
Yeah. No, I guess to piggyback on that, I mean, the UFO field is notorious for its tunnel vision on the nature of UFOs. So what was the reaction to this book? Because I can imagine a lot of people were like, what are you doing? All this other stuff.
Yeah. Well, one of the problems that a lot of people made the mistake, and it was primarily those who hadn't read the book, they were assuming that I'd had some sort of overnight,
Conversion,
that's a good word, yeah, literally. And I was promoting this theory. That was the first mistake a lot of people made. Now, what I was doing, I was promoting the story of the group because it is a fascinating story. I'm not just saying that as the author. A think tank paid and funded to look at the idea that the UFO phenomenon has demonic origins is a story worth telling.
Absolutely.
So that's what I did. So a lot of people made the mistake of criticizing it because they were saying, well, how can you say this when we don't know that there's no evidence for it? And I said, well, hang on, I'm not saying it. I'm relating how this group came to believe that. And the other response was, a lot of people were saying, well, this is fear-mongering, which to an extent, I'm not fear-mongering, but I'm relating stuff that I'll be the first to admit can instill fear in people.
Yeah.
But just because it can instill fear and it's controversial and can worry a lot of people, that's for me not enough reason to bury it.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like, well, okay, if it's true or not, but if it is true, well, it's better that we know. Maybe we can do something about it.
Right.
Regardless of whether these things are literally demonic or not. If there is some connection with the human soul and it becomes an energy source, maybe there is a way to defeat it. And if there is, we should know. So there were people who actually criticized me. Ironic, these are people in the UFO field who believe the government's hiding the truth. And they're saying to me, well, Nick, it might have been better if you've hidden the story.
What?
That's one of
ridiculous.
The biggest irony. That's one of the biggest ironies of all. That there were people who are saying you should have acted with self-censorship because it's too reckless and dangerous a story to tell, whether true or not. And I was like, well, basically, off. And I'm not sure I can say that on air, so I left it out. But we all know what the word was.
Exactly. Yeah, you can say it. But it's all right.
Yeah, all right. I told them fuck off. Because it was like. The last thing the UFO community should be doing with any theory is engaging in self-censorship. That's just ridiculous. So there were things like that. And a lot of people misunderstood, they were suspicious even sometimes. Well, how did you get the story? Why was it given to you? Not realizing that it wasn't given to me. Had I not approached Ray Boucher about the Rendlesham thing, and then Ray said, well, yeah, these guys did work on Rendlesham, but they were also involved in this other stuff. Had it not been for the Rendlesham angle, I would have been none the wiser than anybody else. It was just pure luck and chance that Ray Boucher opened the door, so to speak, that allowed me to dig into this further. So, it was a case of just being in the right place at the right time. And people loudly wanted to know, oh, well, how did Nick know this? This has got to be disinformation because they approached him to get this story out knowing he's an author. No, nobody approached me. I went looking, which is a very different angle.
Exactly.
I only went looking thanks to Ray being willing to speak to me. So.
Well, it's
things like that happen. But it gives you a good appreciation of what, in alternative circumstances, what you can actually find occur in the UFO field, which you never really anticipated would have happened.
Yeah, and it's ironic because, again, well, no pun intended, the government is demonized by the people in the UFO community, but I know, waka waka. But then you look at the events of this story, and it's like the government has more of an open mind about the UFO phenomenon than the UFO research community does, because they're looking at the demon thing with an open mind.
Well, this is one of the biggest ironies. A lot of people forget that government agencies, or the government as a generic body, if you like, has actually addressed numerous theories, far more than the UFO community, for the most part, either entertains the idea. On the one hand, you have the ETH believers. On the other hand, you have the debunkers who say it's weather balloons or whatever. But the government, over the years, has looked at the UFO angle, the secret weapon angle, that's reflected in early FBI files, the Russian angle, that was first addressed, by a panicked military in the summer of 47. The Department of Commerce's Weather Bureau looked at ball lightning in the 40s. The British Ministry of Defence looked at plasmas, with this Condign project. The extraterrestrial angle has been addressed. The Robertson panel of the CIA was less interested in what UFOs were and more how the Russians might exploit it for propaganda purposes. That's like 7 or 8 theories, many of a very intriguing and alternative nature, addressed by government. That's sort of more refreshing and open-minded than those of us in the UFO field,
right.
But what this points out to, I think, is that the government, despite what we think, may actually not really have all the answers. If there was a unified single UFO program that had all the answers, there wouldn't be government agencies looking at weather balloons, at ball lightning, propaganda programs, mogul balloons, aliens, plasmas, et cetera. There would be one program looking at one angle, So This suggests that this gives us some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, that maybe this sort of demonic theory isn't the doomsday scenario that many people might think it is, because that is just one of at least 10 I can think of theories that have been addressed by various think tanks within government. So I think that gives us some hope, and as I said, I think the big flaw was interpreting potential other realms where these things could come from as a literal demonic hell, which does frighten a lot of people, in a country like America, which is heavily Christian-based. It does frighten people, but, should we be frightened of that? Well, yeah. Should we be frightened if it's just another realm that can be explained scientifically? Then maybe not, So.
Right. And to sort of continue that theme of the scariness of it all, is that, towards the end of the book, it's discussed how, the Collins elite and elements within the government sort of come up with this idea to sort of lock down the United States and
like a feudal religious
right
testimony. Yeah, the basic scenario they had of this was the idea of I don't know how they came to this conclusion. I never really got an answer to it, but they believed that belief in, God, so to speak, that belief could actually hold these entities at bay, not laser guns or weaponry, but belief or denial of them. Like, denial of them can hold them at bay is probably the easiest way to explain it. And they believe that the only way that the entire nation could be galvanized to have the strength of belief that was needed would be like a second coming. And if it didn't happen, it would have to be staged to convince, everybody or 99% of the population that that's what it was. And then if belief was so deep, it would stand a chance of keeping these things at bay for however long was needed.
Right.
Now, people say, that's just impossible. There's no way the government could stage a second coming. But I mean, one of the things that I pointed out that's actually surfaced since publication of the book are documents talking about how in the early 60s, the CIA actually planned for this over Cuba. They had a plan. I wish I had this in time to put it in the book, but they had a plan. And I'd have the documents on this now.
I think it might be in the. I think it might be mentioned in the pyramids in the Pentagon.
Yeah, it is.
Actually,
yeah, I put it in the pyramids in the Pentagon. The scenario was that that back in the early '60s they wanted to get rid of Fidel Castro from Cuba by any means possible. One of the plans the military had was to fake a second coming. The idea was to bring boats covertly under cover of night into the harbours off the coast of Cuba and project images of Jesus onto low-level clouds, and then have aircraft flying through the clouds with their engines muffled as much as possible, and guys broadcasting messages saying, "This is Jesus," in simple terms saying, "This is Jesus, I'm on the side of the United States, renounce your allegiance to Fidel Castro and you won't burn in hell." That was basically the scenario. Now, of course, it was never undertaken because it was perceived as being just too difficult. You've got to get the boats in without being blown up. You've got to have the low cloud cover. You've got to hope that the ruse doesn't go wrong. And it was just seen as just too problematic and one of these wacky projects. But it was talked about, planned, and discussed in a round-table setting, which is exactly what the Collins elite said happened just a few years ago. But today, they're not talking about anything like that. They're talking about like sophisticated holograms, to confuse whole masses of people, which is a very different scenario, bringing boats in and kind of cinematic projection equipment and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the idea was, to sort of instill religion more and more in the military and create it, sort of almost like an Old Testament fear-based religion, and I have to be the first to admit religion is playing a bigger and bigger role in the military and government, and there's no doubt about that. And when religion begins to play more of a role in government, it becomes to play more of a dominating role, and you could argue that some of the stuff that the people in the Collins elite said 5 years ago, we're actually now seeing. Sort of, it's like, nobody running for president in the US today can do so without talking loudly about their religious beliefs.
Yeah.
I don't care what they believe at a religious level, but the very fact that they have to promote it demonstrates how significant a role and a growing role it's playing, where any candidate has to say, "This is what I believe," and it's going on more and more, you find some horrible indoctrination programs and intimidation in the military of people who aren't adhering to the idea that, the war in the Middle East is basically, the fight against good and evil. It's a war. It's not a supernatural battle between good and evil at all.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's the scary part that's sort of come out of this post 9/11 world. It's like, I'm no student of U.S. history, but I can't recall any sort of war that was so heavily based along religious lines than this whole thing that's going on now.
It's a war,
Yeah.
It's not a fight for the souls of the planet. There are people who believe that, but that was never broadcast in the Second World War, the First World War, the Vietnam War. It's being done now, and that, interestingly enough, ties in with a lot of what the Collins elite was saying, that, it's to instill fear, and the ultimate scenario that was discussed was like a lockdown of the nation to create like a feudal, dumbed-down society living in fear, but still living. That was the idea. The scenario was, well, if it means the nation isn't what it was in terms of freedom, at least people are still alive. It was sort of like the worst well-meaning scenario you could imagine. You know what I mean?
Right. It's like, well, we're going to survive, but in this horrible position. It's that, the whole book is full of scary scenarios.
That's the thing. You could also have some degree, a small amount of sympathy. If it is true to any degree, have some sympathy for the fact that, well, how can we tell people this, that the Earth's a farm?
Right.
And our souls are basically the food, and the Earth is like the field and the barn, and the soul is like the steak, well done or rare,
Right.
Which I hope isn't true, but
yeah,
who can say?
Yeah, it's scary stuff. Now, what about obviously this Collins elite, they're like a think tank within the U.S., and we've long heard sort of ideas that, you know, really, even though there was this Cold War, that really the Russians and the Americans were kind of on board with this UFO thing, and they knew what was going on. This whole idea, I guess you could say, that you know, the big countries of the planet Earth are in the know on the UFO thing. Did they ever sort of give any indication as to what the Russians or the British intelligence agencies and governments might know about the demonic entity theory, if you will?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I'd say first, Tim, is that, you know, there's no doubt. You know, I don't believe all these theories that, you know, that the Cold War was a charade and that we were friends with the Russian secret all along. But what I do believe, and we know is a fact, is that when it suited them, agencies of opposing hostile nations did work together. You know, the CIA and the KGB did work occasionally on operations together where it was of mutual benefit. So, you know, I don't think we're ever friends as such with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, but grudgingly they would work together, you know, if there was a threat facing both of them and they could wipe it out, you know, together, so to speak. And one of the things that we do know is that there were people within the British establishment and government that, you know, did follow a similar path. I mean, for example, Lord Hill Norton, you know, who was a big advocate of Rendlesham. You know, he had a lot of beliefs that went down this sort of occult pathway. You know, he was a good friend and ally to Gordon Crichton, the former editor of Flying Saucer Review, who was heavily into, you know, the demonic jinn, you know, Middle Eastern jinn type scenario, that it was all a UFO deception. There are a lot of people in the, you know, the British establishment who followed that same path. Now, because they were tied to the establishment, does that mean, you know, they could have been part of some quasi semi-official think tank similar to the Collins elite? You know, they could have been. I have to admit, I've never found evidence of a official group in the Ministry of Defence in Britain or Russia or somewhere that was like, you know, the equivalent of Project Blue Book. I've never found anything like that. But I have found people high up in the British establishment that were interested in UFOs and did believe the occult aspect. So, you know, maybe they've had discussions and talks purely and simply because they're, you know, they're well connected to have those talks.
Yeah. The whole thing, it's very interesting. Like I said, it really adds a whole new layer to the entire history of the UFO phenomenon that I had never
I mean, I'm still digging into it, you know, where I can. It's just kind of, you know, I'm hopeful that more data will come forward, but, you know, I do wonder if it's sort of a testing of the waters and that a deliberate stance was taken where this is how far we're going to go for now, and then, you know, we'll see. You know. Yeah.
Well, did you ever hear from these guys, like, after the book came out or anything like that?
One or two of them, but a lot of them, it was like, you know, just didn't respond to emails, didn't respond to calls. You know, when I mailed copies of the books out, you know, to the addresses I'd got at least, you know, I only got sort of a limited response. And again, that's what makes me, it doesn't make me suspicious of the story, because if it was all disinformation, I don't think it would be so well constructed and more and believable in the sense of it being, you know, them complaining about budgets and whatever. You know, they would portray themselves as, we know this to be fact and we're this all-powerful group, you know, like MJ12. They didn't come across like that. They came across more vulnerable, you know, and underfunded in some respects, which makes sense. So, but I do believe that, you know, things that people might take as suspicious as to how they kind of pretty much cut themselves off from me afterwards, I don't view that as suspicious. I really do think it was more like, okay, let's just sit back and see what the response is, you know, and then do we approach somebody else or do we go to somebody in the mainstream media? You know, I think that could be a possibility. You know, we have to remember that our community, the UFO community, is a relatively small one with like a hardcore of several thousand. In other words, although we're a hardcore of 3,000 or 4,000 UFO researchers, we're also a wide range of society. You know, you could have somebody who buys UFO books who's a scientist, somebody drives the school bus, you know, somebody's a cop, somebody works in Walmart. We're all across the board, which is good, you know, that we've got a good wide range of people. But if the Collins elite or somebody in government wanted to see what the response was to the book across the board, targeting the entire country would be difficult. Why not target our small community, which it knows is made up of variables from every walk of life, and see how they responded to it? maybe that's what it was, like a psychological test, and use the UFO community as like a small version for when they need to sort of try and address what the country as a whole might think, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And what makes it, it makes me wonder if they think that they made a mistake in a sense, because, kudos to you. Different UFO researchers out there might have taken this stuff and just presented it as fact, if you will, or, you know what I mean? And it's like, that's kind of the idea behind disinformation in a lot of ways. We're going to give you this story with the hopes that you're going to go out there and be like, you're not going to believe this, I've got the answer to all this. But really what you did is you put it out there and you were like, right away, hey, this could be disinformation, folks. And it was kind of self-defeating in a way, but on their part, in a sense, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, you always have to be careful how you write about when you present a story. You know, I don't want people to think, I was dismissing the story or endorsing it. I was just telling the story of the group as it existed and how and why they came to their conclusions. But, I'm not some sort of wide-eyed, slack-jawed, oh my God, just swallows everything that comes along. I don't mind relating, unless somebody says to me, I really don't want you to publish what I'm about to tell you. And I truthfully don't, if somebody says that. But otherwise, if I'm given a story and somebody's okay about publishing it, I'll do it. But if I don't believe the story, I'm going to say, I was given this story, just, read it, it's crazy. Or read it because it's interesting, but be aware that I'm not sure, even as the person telling it, if we can verify it or if it's real. I think provided you do that and you're honest about the reasons why you're relating the story and what it could mean or what it couldn't mean, you're not going to fall in the pitfall of endorsing disinformation. You could argue that the Majestic 12 documents are disinformation, but nobody really ever wrote about them from the perspective of being disinformation. The debunkers said it's just some guy in his basement, with an old typewriter, and the UFO researchers said it's vindication for Roswell. Very few people said, well, maybe, Roswell did happen, but this is just designed to confuse things even more, and that's what I tried to do with the Collins Elite story, was to say, well, yeah, it's coming from the government, but let's not just go run into psychiatrists with nervous breakdowns in case it's true, but let's not dismiss it. Let's just try and figure out what's going on by telling the story.
Right, exactly. Well, we need more level-headed sort of, we need more of that level-headed perspective on this, because that may be the only way we're really going to...
Well, yeah, the more controversial something is, the more of a level head rather than a screaming, shrill voice you got to have, because that don't do anybody any good, screaming that the world's going to end.
Right, exactly. Now, I got a couple of general sort of questions for you, just since we haven't talked in so long. We did the year in review episodes quite a bit, a couple times now, and I had the one with Greg this past year as well, and it's followed the sort of pattern where it's moved further and further away from the stories of the year and just sort of bemoaning what I've called the malaise of ufology. And this sort of struck me as I was reading the pyramids and the Pentagon with the section on crop circles, but it feels like really that we're in like a paranormal stasis at this point. It feels like it's not just UFOs. I mean, there's a lot of really compelling crop circles that have happened this summer, but they're not like setting the world on fire. It's an interesting sort of thing that we're in right now. I mean, what do you think of that? I don't believe, I know a lot of people say, well, Benal, you've been doing this for 10 years, you're jaded about all this stuff, but I still think that that can't be the case, or it's not the case, because if you look back on the 80s and the 90s, there were bigger events, it seemed, but now it just seems like there's this stasis, as I said, this paranormal stasis that's gone on for a while. But I mean,
well, no, you're right. You're absolutely right, Tim, because, you go back to the 50s, I mean, even the UFO researchers were getting by the dozen every year, radar reports, pilot encounters. You look at Keogh's books, from the early 50s, jammed with just stuff going on everywhere. South America, landing trace cases, aliens taking soil samples, dogfights over Washington, D.C. Today, it's just like a bunch of YouTube footage, which could go either way,
right.
Real or some kid, face full of spots, doing something in the basement or whatever, with latest bit of software. It's like the classic cases have gone, and it's almost like, ufology has become obsessed with the classic cases because we aren't getting classic cases anymore.
Right.
It's like a lot of ufology has been reduced to turf wars of just still arguing over Socorro or Roswell. I understand they're intriguing and potentially very important cases, but 50 years after Socorro, almost 65 years after Roswell, as a movement, we should really be trying to take the future further and the present, not just still arguing over how many bodies were found at Roswell.
Yeah.
It doesn't take away the significance of it. But you're right. I think in today's world, you can go back to the 80s, when the Majestic 12 documents surfaced, again, regardless what people think about them, regardless what people think about Gulf Breeze, Bob Lazar, there was a tremendous push and a popularity and things going on. And ironically, the subject today is more visible, but less is happening. It's like, there's countless TV shows on UFOs, reality TV shows, but to use an English phrase, they're total bollocks.
Yeah.
Reality TV, if I have to see another group of people running around a haunted house, a wood, a forest, or some old military place saying, what the hell was that at midnight with night scope equipment? I think I'll blow my head off my shoulders. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
But the ironic thing is, there's a saturation of paranormal shows, but nothing's going on in them.
Right.
It's like investigating Bigfoot. Oh, well, we'll go out at night where we can't see anything. If Bigfoot's real, it's still around in the day,
Exactly. You're probably more apt to find it. It's probably sleeping.
Yeah, why go out to investigate a UFO hotspot when it's pitch black? Well, the reason they do it is because night scope footage looks atmospheric. And these shows aren't about solving mysteries or investigating stuff. They're about creating entertainment. And the problem is, one of the reasons why ufology is in such doldrums is because investigative work has been replaced by entertainment. And when that happens, it just causes disaster. We need to get back to the grassroots. But the other problem is we're not getting those grassroots classic reports anymore. It's like the phenomenon has changed as well. Not just ufology hasn't just changed in terms of being the medium of this or that. The cases and the phenomena itself has altered the way it sort of manifests and whatever. I mean, even abductions, they aren't reported on the scale as they were in, say, the 80s.
Right.
When it was almost like a plague, it was like a zombie virus. Everybody was infected and, by abductions.
Right. Like that's kind of the line I was drawing to the crop circle thing. And then you can go to like cattle mutilations. I mean, I'm sure they're still happening, but they're not, I don't know, it hasn't crossed some line of newness.
God, well, I mean, when as you know, I'm originally from England. I can remember 1989, 1991, when crop circles were literally the main story on the BBC News.
Wow.
I mean, when the whole thing with Colin Andrews and, was at its height, it was at mainstream BBC News, this formation's been found. And there was like this cultural time, like a peak for a while, where everybody in the nation was just, oh my God, what's going to happen? Is this it? Are the aliens going to land? And that's not a joke or an exaggeration. Kind of like when an entire culture briefly gets behind something. It was like that.
Right.
But today now, more crop circles, it's good for the tourists and there'll be nice colour photographs splashed across, this newspaper or that newspaper. And it's just become, that's what it is. It's the wonderment, if you like, has gone. And maybe part of it is just the jadedness of people, seen it before, done it before, whatever, what I mean?
Right.
I think part of it is that. But I think equally, it's like maybe some of these phenomena, whatever they are, have given up on us.
Yeah. That's I've said that on the show before, where I've likened the UFO phenomenon to like an ex-girlfriend, where it's like, we had some good times.
You want to stay in touch, you want to do the right thing, but at the end of the day, joking aside, maybe to put it bluntly, maybe that there was a period when whatever this phenomenon is has tried to get us to do the right thing, and we've constantly screwed up. We're destroying the planet. People are getting unhealthier and bigger. Pollution's getting worse. There's deforestation, and maybe in alien terms, somebody has just literally said, "Fuck 'em."
Yeah.
Maybe that is what's happened, and what we're seeing now is just the residual after effects of some phenomenon that bit by bit is slowly going away, whatever, and occasionally it stays around, or somebody thinks, the equivalent of, well, I'll give them a try for the next couple of months, and they're like, fine, you're on your own, we're going,
Right. Like monthly checkups, or like annual checkups, or, every few years
then they become bi-monthly, and then yearly, and then it's like, well, the infestation's spreading, sorry. There's no, it's like the equivalent, we can't do any more chemotherapy for you, we're very sorry, but...
Right.
You shouldn't have smoked for 50 years or whatever,
I'm doing my best to quit. I'm doing my best, Nick.
Good man.
Now, what about the other thing, just on a wholly sort of broad perspective, because I think, I like to look at these sort of things on a big scale. I find it kind of interesting. Here we are, it's the long-awaited 2012, and even 2012 has sort of gone to the back burner. I'm sure it'll ramp up as we get towards December, but... It's interesting. Everyone was all worked up about 2012, but I haven't heard too much about it this year. Maybe everyone's just sort of trepidatious about what's going to happen.
Well, I think, unfortunately, in today's world, it's very easy to frighten people, and people do, get hysterical and whatever, and people also have a short attention span, so it's like when it goes away, they forget about it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like bird flu. I never got inoculated for bird flu. I had people around me said, the nations, everybody's going to get bird flu, we're all going to die. I said, well, fine, go and queue up at the nearest pharmacy and get your bird flu injection. Who remembers that now? Everybody's forgotten about it, all those doomsday stories. And I think that's like 2012. And it probably will, and I'm sure it'll resurface the closer and closer we get to December the 21st. But, I don't think anything's going to happen. And I think by December the 21st of the next year, it'll be as forgotten as Y2K. But people are easy to whip up into a frenzy when it is big news.
Yeah.
But equally, they quickly forget as well. So.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how all this unfolds, and to go back to that idea of the paranormal stasis. Like I said earlier, I got to give you credit because you're putting out fresh stuff. You're putting out stuff that hasn't really been done before.
Too. Yeah, if truthfully, I'm not just saying this. If I was thinking about a new idea for a book, and I couldn't find anything new, specifically new to write about, I would never go down the path of doing, a roundup of the top 50 famous abduction stories. Do 5 pages regurgitated from somebody's book on Betty and Barney Hill, and then 5 pages on the Andreasen case or whatever, or Whitley Strieber, where it's all been published before, because there's just no point. If you're going to write a book, it's like you with a radio show. You want to get guests on who've got something fresh and new to say. It's great to have somebody who's been in the field 50 years and who gives you all their background, and you do a sort of like paying homage to them type show. That's cool. But I'm sure you wouldn't want just a show that is a roundup of everything we know about this case or that case for 2 hours. It's pointless.
Exactly.
So, one of my criteria has always been whether people agree with me or not, or like me or not. I don't really care, but I do try and put out new data, whether people agree with it or not, because what's the point of doing it otherwise? There is no point.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, you kind of hit what we've been doing here on the show. People always seem to link me to UFOs, but if you look at the archive, we haven't really done too many UFO shows like in the last couple of years, because it's, as I said earlier.
Because you got so much else new to talk about.
Right. Exactly. Now, speaking of new, what you said you get the new book coming out around Halloween. What do you have on the horizon not just this year, but, in the future.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, that one, The World's Weirdest Places, comes out sort of October time, which is a study of my favourite sort of top 25 paranormal hotspots around the planet. And then I've also done one for Patrick Weege's Anomalous books, which is called Monster Diary. That'll be, I think that might be out before the end of the year as well. It's basically, I write my cryptozoological books very different to, things like Final Events or Body Snatchers, which is just like a straightforward relating of the facts. But because, the crypto stuff I do, the monster hunting is all on the road stuff, I write it as like a road trip style.
Yeah.
I sort of hit the road at midnight, and drove down this foggy road in search of whatever. I like to write it as it actually happens. So that one will be out, Monster Diary, I think probably before the end of the year. Definitely not before The World's Weirdest Places. That would be too much overkill, even for me. People would be like, just go away for a while. And I wouldn't blame them. Even I wouldn't blame them for saying that. But that'll be out after that, I think, possibly round about the end of the year. Then I'm working on another crypto book for, again, I'm not sure when that'll be out, but I think into 2013. That's called Wild Man, and that's going to be published in Britain. It's all about Bigfoot and wild man type reports from Britain, which they're actually a surprisingly massive amount of reports, but most of them have sort of paranormal aspects to them, or Fortean aspects. And so it addresses a subject, again, that's not really been the subject of a book before, Bigfoot in Britain.
Yeah.
So that'll be out. And then, just really weirdly, like you said, I was actually being given a lot of consideration to the idea of a book about what the government knows about these so-called cryptid animals.
Yeah, I would love that.
And I'm also working on a book which, when I've done these two Men in Black books, On the Trail of the Saucer Spies and The Real Men in Black, it actually prompted a lot of people to come forward with their own Men in Black stories, which had never been published before. And, everybody who was willing to have their stories published has now sort of given their permission, and they're all speaking on the record, nobody's speaking off the record or whatever.
Nice.
And so I'm doing a book which is basically a collection of the stories in their own words, no interruptions from me, but then with like a comment section afterwards, like a comment/analysis thing of each case from me. So it's like case 1, case 2, then Nick's analysis of the case. And there's something like 50 or 60 when I say brand new, I mean some of them are old, but just never been discussed before. But in that sense, sort of 50, 60 brand new MIB cases, spanning the 40s to the present day, literally.
Nice.
And this will be sort of the third MIB book I've done, which I think I might make these an ongoing thing, because I'm quite interested in all the MIB stuff, and there's certainly enough material, to sort of, again, if I bring something fresh, to, keep trying to dig into who these MIB are. So.
Awesome. So you got a lot going on. I'm looking forward to it. And like I said,
always the blogging and, articles for websites and that sort of stuff, lecturing. I'm speaking at the Paradigm Symposium in Minneapolis in October. And this month I've got September I've got 2 lectures. One for a Dallas-based group called the Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council, EPIC. That'll be the third weekend in September. Then the last weekend, the Saturday night, I'm speaking at the Austin Center for Spiritual Living in Austin, Texas, on pyramids and the Pentagon. So there'll be those 2 in September, the Paradigm Symposium in Minneapolis in October, where there'll actually be a lot of sort of ancient astronaut people, like Eric von Daniken speaking there.
Yeah, that's a big event. That's definitely a big event.
Marie Jones will be there. Larry Flaxman, they did, Marie did the 2012 book.
Mm-hmm.
So, there'll be a lot of interesting lectures, I think. So.
Yeah. If I had any money, I'd be there, but...
Well, maybe they'll cover it if you say you're going to promote it or whatever, you never know.
That's true. I got to see how much it costs to fly to Minneapolis, but maybe it can be done. Well, I can't thank you enough, Nick. Like I said at the beginning, it's been way too long since I had you on the program for a pure paranormal discussion, and it's not going to be another 5 years before we do it again, because there's just so much stuff to cover that I just thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and the time flew by. That's all I can tell. It's been a good show. It's like already been over 2 hours, and I'm just stunned by that.
Thanks for having me on, Tim. I had a good time. I mean, we covered a lot of ground, and a lot of areas, and sort of demystified a lot of stuff, and, covered a lot of paradigms and ideas. And I'll have to try and get back out to your area as well at some point and come and hang out for some of that good beer again.
Absolutely, my friend. The Pyramids and the Pentagon, that's from New Page Books. Final Events is from Anomalist Books, and there's just, as we've said over the course of this conversation, tons and tons more books by Nick Redfern. Folks, go out and pick them up. You will love them. Thank you once again for coming on the show, Nick.
Thanks a lot, Tim.
That does it for this edition of BOA Audio Season 7. Big thanks to Nick Redfern for coming back on the show and giving us so much time. Be sure to check out the two books which we discussed here on the program this week, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, as well as Final Events. And if you want to know more about Nick Redfern, head on over to his website, www.nickredfernfortean.blogspot.com. Pretty simple, all one word, nickredfernfortean.blogspot.com. Check it out. Moving right along now, it's time for BOA audio listener feedback, and we've got 4 quick messages here from the BOA audio listeners, so let's dive on in. First one comes from Sandra in Liverpool, England, and here's what she has to say. Just a quick message to say a big thank you for your fantastic interviews. I have had my eyes opened over the years, and your podcast is right up there at the top of my faves. I love your technique, and you impress me when you don't force your opinion, which must be hard sometimes, but you do a really great job. Thanks, Sandra in Liverpool, England. Well, thank you, Sandra, for writing in. Much appreciated, and really humbling kudos on the program. I am very thankful for your kind words. Part of the reason why I picked this email here, beyond the fact that Sandra was writing to us from Liverpool, England, and you all know I love the international listeners, was her thoughts on my technique and how I don't force my opinion on the listeners or the guest. That is, of course, a conscious decision on my part. You'd be amazed how many people I meet who want to know what I really think of all this stuff, want to know my thoughts on a whole bunch of different paranormal mysteries, and confess that they cannot decipher it from listening to the program. I take a great deal of pride in that, because it is my job really to get the guest on here and have them present their work and have the listeners decide. I don't want to sway people's opinion on the veracity of the guest's material. Although I think people who've been listening a long enough time will be able to really kind of figure out where I stand on a number of issues. But there are plenty which sit in my gray basket, and I'm just willing to sort of give it the benefit of the doubt and wait to see whether it's proven right or wrong. I just really enjoy the mystery aspect of all this, and trying to get to the bottom of it is the goal of the program, but at the same time, the journey is as much the reward as is the final answers. Next email comes from Joshua, no hometown listed. Here's what he has to say. I have a theory about irrational fear of clowns. I believe that the reason some adults have an irrational fear of clowns is because they were abducted as children. I remember some researchers saying that aliens would mask themselves as a child-loving image to remove fear. I believe clowns are being used by the abductors. However, after so many abductions, the child becomes afraid of clowns, as they have always led to a terrifying experience. A fear they cannot understand, but very real. What do you think of this, Joshua? I don't know what to think of that, Joshua. That's an interesting theory, although I'm skeptical in a sense, because clowns really are kind of creepy in and of themselves. Just looking at them and their bizarre face paint kind of puts a chill down many people's spines, whether they've been abducted or not. I suppose aliens disguising themselves as clowns to abduct children has probably happened in the past, but I'm not sure it's as rampant as you kind of put forward here in this hypothesis, because I think we probably would have more anecdotes or revelations about this clown abduction theory, and I've never really heard it put forward in a big way by anybody in the abduction research community, which of course is already fraught with all sorts of problems in and of itself. It's certainly something worth considering. It's definitely something that's given me pause and had me take a second look at clowns, which I never thought I'd be doing. But as I said, I don't think it's as rampant as you think, but anything's possible. Probably more in this modern age. I think that aliens would be disguising themselves as whatever little kids are into nowadays, because clowns are really antiquated, and they're not as big as they were in the 50s and 60s for sure. So maybe nowadays the clowns are disguising themselves, as I said, as figures in children's entertainment beyond clowns. But definitely something worth considering, and those are my thoughts on it, and I'd be interested in hearing what the BOA audio listeners think about this clown theory. And of course, thank you for writing in, Joshua. Next email comes from Marty in Paisley, Scotland. Here's what he has to say. Just started catching up with Season 7. Wow, great shows. The cruise line episode was definitely disturbing. I, like you, was getting mad listening to the outrageous crimes that are being committed aboard these ships, and have to ask why the governments of the countries where these victims come from are not actively acting on the victims' families' behalf to give them closure, but instead seem to be turning the other cheek. I wonder if a government's official was a victim, would there be any other outcome other than what was stated on the show? Outrageous. Again, great shows. Keep up the great standard and content. Marty from Paisley, Scotland. Thank you for writing in, Marty. I think, based on what Kendall Carver was telling us on the program a few episodes ago, it definitely seems like the U.S. government is stonewalling getting behind investigating these crimes. There certainly seems to be evidence that that is the case. Around the world, however, I think countries like the UK and Australia, I think perhaps their government officials are in turn being stonewalled by the cruise ship companies. There is really quite a disconnect between these ships out at sea and the folks on the land, where you really got to get to the bottom of these crimes very quickly, and that disconnect, as well as the purposeful stonewalling by the cruise ship industry, opens up a huge vacuum of time where perpetrators of these crimes quite simply just get away with what they've done. There's a big problem, as Kendall Carver said on the program, and it's still resonating here with the listeners, as evidenced by what Marty has said. And as far as if a government official's family was a victim, I'm sure we'd see a very different approach to this whole issue. But ironically enough, doesn't it always seem like governments' families never are victims of these bizarre crimes or disappearances or strange happenings? You never hear of a government official's son or daughter being abducted by an alien or go missing in a national park. These things simply just do not happen to them. I don't know what that's all about, but it's definitely something worth considering. Thank you again, of course, for writing in, Marty from Paisley, Scotland. And the final message this week comes from Flapdoodle in Austin, Texas, and this was posted on our BOA Facebook page. And here's what Flapdoodle has to say. Haunted objects? I need to listen again. I think Robert the Doll did something to me during his segment. The last thing I remember when listening is the mention of his name. His? OMG, now I'm doing it. Flapdoodle in Austin, Texas. Kind of a funny one there to wrap things up. That was posted on the Banal of America Facebook page. Please allow me to plug it here before I respond to Flapdoodle. Head on over to Facebook, punch in Banal of America. We've got an official page there. If you have not yet and you want to and can, please like us on Facebook. We're trying to get to 1,000 likes. And as I reflected on during last week's program, there really is no reward for 1,000 likes. It's just a moronic milestone to aim for. Nonetheless, head on over to Banal of America on Facebook and like us. With regards to what Flapdoodle has to say, I really don't have much of a response to that, although I presume that he or she enjoyed the program. I was really spooked out by that episode, to be quite honest with you. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but after I hung up the phone, after talking to Chris and Tim, I was a little just chilled by how strange some of that stuff was. It's one thing to be pestered by a ghost. You can kind of put your finger on it, even though it is pretty bizarre and odd that you got to deal with a ghost haunting you. But if it's an object, how do you even deal with that? That's the weird part. And Robert the Doll and the story of the persistently haunted poster board that had the bloody Our Father on it. Just creepy stuff. Really creepy stuff. I hope that you did go back to listen to the program again. Flapdoodle, and beware of Robert the Doll. Treat him with respect, and he will protect you. Disrespect him, and he will curse you. Creepy stuff, folks. And on that note, we'll zip up the BOA audio listener feedback mailbag for this week. Big thanks to Flapdoodle in Austin, Texas for writing in. Thanks to Marty from Paisley, Scotland for writing in. Thanks to Joshua and Sandra in Liverpool, England for also writing in. If you'd like to be a part of future installments of BOA audio listener feedback, there are a number of ways to get in touch with me. You can simply head on over to binalofamerica.com, BINNALL ofamerica.com, and click the contact button, or write to boaaudio@hotmail.com. And if you want something a little more interactive, there are two highly interactive ways to get in touch with me. You can join up at the official BOA forum, the US of E.com, THEUSOFE.com. That is BOA's Paranormal Playground, our official message board where we talk about the world of the paranormal as well as pop culture. And additionally, if you want some interactive goodness, join up at the official BOA page on Facebook. Just punch in Banal of America and you'll find it on there very quickly and easily. And of course, I am on Facebook and Twitter, so feel free to search out Banal and befriend me, follow me, or poke me. It's all good, and I'd be happy to have you as part of my online circle of friends. And now, please allow me to pause and give thanks to the outstanding and esteemed BOA staff. Leslie, Chiron, Regan Lee, Joe V, Tina Senna, Richard Thomas, Marla Pena, Bruce Pretty, Tony Morrill, and our webmaster, Jeremy Boston. Since the last time you heard from me, I have yet to post new columns from the BOA staff, but I am sitting on an all-new Trickster's Realm from Regan Lee, as well as an all-new Esotericana from Tina Senna. Those will be posted at Banal of America later on this week, so be sure to head on over to BOA for additional insights from the BOA staff. BOA, make it a part of your search for esoteric news and opinion. Now comes the time in the program where I turn to you, the hardcore BOA audio listeners, and ask you to help us out via a donation to the BOA franchise. How do you do that? That's simple. There are two ways to do so. You can head on over to Banal of America and click the PayPal button. It's on the left-hand side of the screen. That'll take you to PayPal. They'll walk you through the process. It's safe, secure, and simple. But what if you don't trust the internet? What if you want to donate via snail mail? Well, you can do that, folks. You can send your donations to Tim Banal, P.O. Box 232, Pinehurst, Mass. 01866. And you spell Pinehurst Pinehurst. The complete address can be found at Banal of America underneath the PayPal button. And if you mail us a donation, please make it payable to Tim Banal and not Banal of America, because my bank is anal and will not cash those donations. And please include some form of correspondence so I can write you back and thank you for your donation. As always, it is worth noting here, folks, no donation is too small, and all donations go towards Banal of America and BOA Audio to help keep the entire franchise up and running, freely available, and commercial-free for all of our great readers and listeners the world over. On the next edition of BOA Audio, I meant to mention this at the beginning of this program, but we've got sort of a plan here as we roll through the rest of 2012. let's say, for instance, the world is going to end on December 21st, 2012. What's the best way, really, to get us prepared for that? That is to welcome back some of the classic guests from the program, longtime friends of the show, starting with this week's program here with Nick Redfern, going all the way through 2012, bringing back some old friends of the show. So on the next edition of the program, it's only frighteningly 2 short weeks away from Thanksgiving, which means it's time once again for our now annual holiday tradition known as Ruxgiving, where we welcome back the extremely popular Bruce Rux to BOA Audio. Of course, we had Bruce on in July for what was a somber and solemn edition of the program, talking about the Aurora shootings. This time around, it's going to be much lighter as we bring Bruce on the program for a jam session covering the world of the esoteric, covering UFOs, covering all sorts of stuff. I could tell you more, but I haven't even taped the episode yet. Probably going to tape it next week. But I have gotten confirmation from Bruce that he is in for Ruxgiving 2012. So that will be the next edition of the program. And since I'm talking to the hardcore BOA Audio listeners, I'll give you a little teaser for what's to come in the weeks leading up to the end of 2012. We're going to be welcoming back longtime friends of the show, Marie Jones and Larry Flaxman, for a mind-bending edition of the program talking about time travel. And we'll also have another longtime friend of the show, Paul Kimball, talking about his new book, The Other Side of Truth. And by the time you hear those 2 episodes, again, frighteningly enough, it will be time for the holidays. So we'll be having, I hope, the legendary Stan Friedman on for our annual holiday special, and our good buddy Greg Bishop for the year in review wrap-up. If you're someone who wants to hear new guests, you want to hear fresh folks on the program, do not be dismayed, because I've already lined up a bunch of amazing guests for the beginning of 2013 and going forward. So we're going to have a lot of old friends here on the show as we wrap up the year, and then once 2013 kicks off, we're going to have some truly tremendous folks on the program to help us get the new year started in a big way. So that's pretty much the state of the program here as we close out the year. Next week on the program, the amazing Bruce Rux joins us for Ruxgiving 2012. And on that note, we close the book on this edition of the program. Big thanks once again to Nick Redfern for coming on the show. Big thanks to Sandra in Liverpool, England, Joshua, Marty from Paisley, Scotland, and Flapdoodle in Austin, Texas for their contributions to BOA Audio listener feedback. And, of course, enormous thanks to all you folks out there, the hardcore BOA Audio listeners, the folks who tune in to the very end of the show. You guys are the best. Thank you for your enduring support of this program. It is truly humbling and tremendously appreciated. Thank you once again for making BOA Audio a part of your esoteric audio playlist. Until next time, this is Tim Binnall, thanking you for listening and signing off.